I am Chloe, 34 years old, and returning to New York to attend my divorce hearing. I helped an elderly man on my flight who simply called himself a retired law professor. He offered to accompany me to the courthouse. When we arrived, the moment my arrogant husband and his high-powered attorney saw this fragile old man walking beside me, their faces turned pale with absolute terror. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to completely destroy someone who severely underestimated your worth. We were cruising at 30,000 feet somewhere over the Midwest. I rested my head against the cold plastic of the airplane window, utterly exhausted. I was flying back to New York after a grueling 2-week data privacy audit on the West Coast that had drained every ounce of my energy. The steady hum of the jet engines usually lulled me to sleep, but my mind was racing. I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop, deciding to connect to the in-flight wireless internet to clear out some emails before we landed at JFK. The moment my phone synchronized with the network, a notification chimed in my headset. It was a text message from my husband, Julian. He was the chief executive officer of a prominent health technology startup, a man whose ego had grown entirely out of control over our 5-year marriage. We had been arguing for months, but I expected another mundane message about logistics or his upcoming corporate events. Instead, the words on the screen felt like a physical blow to my chest. He wrote, "I froze the joint accounts. The divorce papers are already filed. Sign the $15,000 settlement at the mediation tomorrow, or my lawyers will make sure you legally inherit half of my company's $5 million corporate debt. Do not bother fighting me on this." I stared at the glowing screen as the sheer cruelty of his message washed over me. $15,000 was a microscopic fraction of the life we had built together. It was a deliberate insult meant to break my spirit and force me into a corner. He expected me to panic. He expected me to cry and frantically call him from the airplane bathroom begging for mercy. But Julian fundamentally misunderstood the woman he had married. I did not break down in tears. I closed my text messages and coldly opened my banking application. A small loading circle spun on the screen for a few agonizing seconds before the dashboard loaded. My checking account balance was exactly zero. My stomach dropped, but I forced my hands to remain steady as I navigated to my retirement savings portfolio. Gone. Every single penny of my hard-earned savings had been completely wiped out. I am a senior data privacy auditor for a massive medical conglomerate. My entire career is built on tracking secure information, finding hidden digital footprints, and exposing corporate leaders who break the rules. I took a deep breath, letting the icy reality of the situation sharpen my focus. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I immediately began mapping out a secure network pathway to trace exactly where Julian had moved my money. I was just about to bypass his company's basic security firewall when a sudden violent gasp broke my intense concentration. My hands hovered over the keyboard as I initiated a secure encrypted tunnel into Julian corporate server. I knew his system architecture intimately because I was the one who designed his initial data compliance protocols 3 years ago. He was arrogant enough to lock me out of our personal bank accounts, but he was incredibly foolish to think he could hide digital transactions from a senior privacy auditor. I routed my connection through a proxy server and prepared to execute a script that would expose every single offshore transfer he made in the last 48 hours. My finger was resting heavily on the enter key when a sudden loud thud echoed directly to my right. I jumped and instinctively slammed my laptop shut. I turned my head and saw the elderly man sitting in the aisle seat slumped forward awkwardly. His breathing was terribly ragged, and his hands were clutching his chest. A heavy leather briefcase had slipped from his lap and crashed onto the floor of the cabin, spilling hundreds of dense legal documents across the narrow aisle. Several passengers in our row glanced over, but nobody moved to help. The classic bystander effect was in full motion. I immediately unbuckled my seatbelt and leaned over. I asked him if he was all right, but his skin was pale and covered in a cold sweat. He could barely form a word. I recognized the signs of a severe cardiovascular event or a drastic drop in blood pressure. I reached up and pressed the flight attendant call button multiple times in rapid succession. When a crew member rushed over, I firmly instructed her to bring an oxygen tank and an emergency medical kit right away. I loosened the tight silk tie around the elderly man's neck and kept speaking to him in a calm and steady voice, making sure he remained conscious. After a few agonizing minutes of receiving oxygen and a small dose of aspirin from the medical kit, his breathing slowly stabilized. The terrifying gray hue left his face replaced by a more natural color. He leaned back against the seat and let out a long, shaky breath. He thanked me in a fragile whisper, apologizing for the massive disruption. I assured him it was absolutely no trouble at all. I told him to just rest while I cleaned up the mess on the floor. I knelt in the cramped space and began gathering the avalanche of paperwork that had spilled from his heavy briefcase. The documents were incredibly complex. They were highly confidential federal trust agreements and corporate tax restructuring forms. As I stacked the papers back together, my trained auditor eyes automatically scanned the columns of financial data. I honestly could not help it. Finding anomalies in financial structures is practically wired into my DNA. While organizing a particularly thick stack of asset reallocation forms, my gaze caught a glaring structural flaw buried deep within a liability clause. I carefully placed the neat stack of documents onto his tray table. I apologized for prying into his confidential paperwork, but I gently tapped a specific paragraph on the top page. I told him that whoever drafted this corporate trust made a catastrophic error regarding the capital gains distribution. I explained that if this document was filed exactly as written, his client would be exposed to a multi-million-dollar tax penalty by the federal government within the next fiscal quarter. The elderly man looked at the document and then looked up at me. The physical fragility of his medical episode vanished entirely in that single moment. His eyes sharpened with an intense and razor-sharp intellect that felt almost intimidating. He studied the numbers I pointed out, and a slow, deeply appreciative smile spread across his weathered face. He murmured that he had 3 senior partners review this exact file, and not a single one of them caught that specific discrepancy. He told me I just saved him from a very embarrassing and costly legal disaster. I smiled and told him it was just what I do for a living. I introduced myself as Chloe, a data privacy auditor. He extended a steady hand toward me and introduced himself as Marcus Sterling, claiming he was just a retired law professor heading back into the city. I shook his hand, unaware of just how powerful this man truly was. Before we could speak any further, the captain announced our final descent into New York. I packed my laptop away, bracing myself for the absolute nightmare waiting for me on the ground. The moment the aircraft wheels hit the tarmac and the cellular network reconnected, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a picture message from Lexi. She was Julian, 23-year-old public relations assistant. She was also the woman he was abandoning our marriage for. I opened the message and my blood instantly turned to ice. The photograph showed Lexi standing in front of a luxury private terminal. She was leaning against Julian's brand-new sports car, but that was not what made my stomach churn. Shining brightly around her neck was my late grandmother's antique diamond necklace. The necklace had gone missing from my jewelry box 2 weeks ago. Julian had sworn to my face that he knew absolutely nothing about it. Below the devastating image was a caption that read, "Julian says this diamond looks so much better on me. See you at the baggage claim." I stared at the photograph of my family heirloom on his mistress. The tears he desperately wanted from me still did not come. Instead, a terrifying and icy calm settled completely over my mind. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and waited for the cabin doors to open. I was walking off this airplane and stepping directly onto a battlefield. My hands hovered over the keyboard as I initiated a secure, encrypted tunnel into Julian's corporate server. I knew his system architecture intimately because I was the one who designed his initial data compliance protocols 3 years ago. He was arrogant enough to lock me out of our personal bank accounts, but he was incredibly foolish to think he could hide digital transactions from a senior privacy auditor. I routed my connection through a proxy server and prepared to execute a script that would expose every single offshore transfer he made in the last 48 hours. My finger was resting heavily on the enter key when a sudden violent gasp broke my intense concentration. A loud, heavy thud echoed directly to my right. I jumped and instinctively slammed my laptop shut. I turned my head and saw the elderly man sitting in the aisle seat slumped forward awkwardly. His breathing was terribly ragged and his hands were clutching his chest with a terrifying desperation. The color was draining from his face at an alarming rate, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. A heavy leather briefcase had slipped from his lap and crashed onto the floor of the cabin, spilling hundreds of dense legal documents across the narrow aisle. Several passengers in our row glanced over, but nobody moved to help. People simply stared, completely paralyzed by the sudden crisis. The classic bystander effect was in full motion, but I do not freeze under pressure. My entire career relies on identifying critical failures and neutralizing them before they cause a total system collapse. This was a biological system failure, and I needed to act immediately. I immediately unbuckled my seatbelt and leaned over him. I asked him if he was all right, but his skin was covered in a cold, clammy sweat, and he could barely form a single word. His eyes were wide with panic. I recognized the undeniable signs of a severe cardiovascular event. I reached up and pressed the flight attendant call button multiple times in rapid succession, not waiting for a casual response. When a crew member rushed over looking flustered, I did not ask for help. I commanded the space. I firmly instructed her to bring an oxygen tank and the emergency medical kit right away. I told her we had a suspected cardiac episode and needed to page for a doctor on board while simultaneously preparing an aspirin dose. While she scrambled to follow my orders, I turned my attention back to the elderly man. I gently but quickly loosened the tight silk tie around his neck and unbuttoned the top of his crisp dress shirt to help him breathe. I kept speaking to him in a calm, steady, and authoritative voice, demanding that he keep his eyes open and focus entirely on the sound of my voice. I told him he was going to be completely fine and that we were taking control of the situation. The flight attendant returned with the medical kit. I quickly retrieved a low-dose aspirin and instructed him to chew it slowly. Within a few agonizing minutes of receiving the oxygen flow and the medication, his erratic breathing finally began to stabilize. The terrifying gray hue slowly left his face, replaced by a much more natural color. He leaned back heavily against the seat headrest and let out a long, shaky breath. He thanked me in a fragile whisper, apologizing profusely for causing such a massive disruption on the flight. I offered him a warm, reassuring smile and told him it was absolutely no trouble at all. I instructed him to just sit back, close his eyes, and focus on his breathing while I took care of the mess on the floor. I knelt down in the cramped aisle space and began gathering the absolute avalanche of paperwork that had spilled from his heavy leather briefcase. The documents were incredibly dense and heavily redacted in certain areas. They were highly confidential federal trust agreements, corporate tax restructuring forms, and complex asset allocation spreadsheets. I began stacking the papers back together into neat, organized piles. As I smoothed out the pages, my trained auditor eyes automatically scanned the intricate columns of financial data and legal jargon. I honestly could not help it. Finding anomalies in financial structures is practically wired into my fundamental DNA. I spend 80 hours a week dissecting corporate ledgers to find the exact places where wealthy people try to hide their money or evade their legal responsibilities. While organizing a particularly thick stack of asset reallocation forms, my gaze caught a glaring structural flaw buried incredibly deep within a secondary liability clause. It was a subtle miscalculation regarding the federal capital gains distribution and a massive oversight in the depreciation schedule of the trust real estate assets. I carefully placed the neat stack of legal documents onto his sturdy tray table. I apologized for prying into his highly confidential paperwork, but I gently tapped a specific paragraph on the top page with my index finger. I kept my voice low so nobody else could hear. I told him that whoever drafted this corporate trust agreement made a catastrophic error right here in this section. I explained clearly that they had completely misapplied the standard deduction rate for the commercial properties listed in the portfolio. I told him that if this document was filed exactly as it was currently written, the cascading effect on the bottom line would be utterly devastating. His client would be completely exposed to a multi-million-dollar tax penalty by the federal government within the very first fiscal quarter of the year. The elderly man stopped resting. He opened his eyes, looked at the document on the tray table, and then looked directly up at me. The physical fragility of his recent medical episode vanished entirely in that single defining moment. His posture straightened slightly, and his eyes sharpened with an intense, razor-sharp intellect that felt almost incredibly intimidating. He was no longer a frail passenger needing medical assistance. He was a man evaluating my competence. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a pair of reading glasses, and deliberately studied the exact numbers I had pointed out. A slow, deeply appreciative smile spread across his weathered face. He murmured that he had 3 separate senior partners at a top-tier law firm review this exact file over the past week, and not a single one of them had caught that specific discrepancy. He looked at me with a profound sense of genuine respect. He told me I had just saved him from a very embarrassing and incredibly costly legal disaster. I smiled warmly and told him it was just what I do for a living. I introduced myself as Chloe, a senior data privacy auditor. I explained that analyzing numbers and finding the hidden truth within complex systems is much easier for me than dealing with the unpredictable nature of people. He extended a steady, firm hand toward me and introduced himself as Marcus Sterling. He claimed he was simply a retired law professor heading back into the city to visit some former students. I shook his hand firmly, feeling an unexpected sense of comfort in his calm, authoritative presence. I had absolutely no idea at that moment just how powerful this man truly was, or how incredibly crucial he would soon become in dismantling the arrogant empire my husband was actively trying to use to destroy my entire life. Marcus kept his eyes fixed on me for a long moment. The sheer astonishment on his face was impossible to miss. He carefully folded his reading glasses and tucked them away, clearly re-evaluating the woman sitting next to him. He started to ask me another question about my specific background in corporate compliance, his tone shifting from polite gratitude to deep professional curiosity. But before we could dive any deeper into the conversation, the sudden sharp chime of the cabin intercom interrupted us. The captain announced our final descent into New York. The flight attendants quickly moved through the aisles to secure the cabin, forcing us to stow our tray tables and abruptly end our discussion. I packed my laptop securely into my leather briefcase, bracing myself for the absolute nightmare that was waiting for me on the ground. The moment the heavy aircraft wheels hit the tarmac at the airport, the cabin erupted with the familiar sounds of seatbelts unclicking and people shifting in their seats. I reached into my jacket pocket and turned my cellular network back on. Instantly, my phone vibrated with a rapid succession of incoming notifications. One specific message caught my immediate attention. It was a picture message from Lexi. Lexi was Julian's 23-year-old public relations assistant, the exact same woman he was currently abandoning our marriage for. She was incredibly arrogant and constantly flaunted her lifestyle on social media. I tapped the screen to open the message, and the blood in my veins instantly turned to absolute ice. The high-resolution photograph loaded on my screen showing Lexi standing proudly outside the airport arrival terminal. She was leaning seductively against the hood of Julian's brand new custom supercar, a vehicle he claimed he could never afford while we were married. She was wearing a smug, victorious smile that practically radiated through the screen. But it was not her arrogant expression or the incredibly expensive car that made my stomach completely drop. Shining brightly around her neck, perfectly catching the airport lights, was my late grandmother's antique diamond necklace. That specific heirloom necklace had mysteriously gone missing from my locked jewelry box exactly 2 weeks ago. When I panicked and searched our entire house, Julian had looked me directly in the eyes and sworn under his breath that he knew absolutely nothing about it. He even had the audacity to suggest that I had carelessly misplaced it during one of my corporate business trips. Beneath the devastating photograph was a short, cruel caption. "Julian says these diamonds look so much better on young skin. See you at the baggage claim." I stared at the glowing screen as the sheer audacity of her message washed over me. He had not just stolen my retirement funds and frozen my bank accounts. He had stolen a priceless piece of my family history to drape around the neck of his mistress. He expected this final, deeply personal blow to completely shatter my resolve. But the tears he so desperately wanted from me simply did not come. Instead, a terrifying and icy calm settled completely over my mind. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and gripped the handle of my heavy briefcase. I was no longer just an exhausted woman flying home from a business trip. I was walking off this airplane and stepping directly onto a battlefield. I walked down the jet bridge with singular focus. The sheer exhaustion that had weighed down my bones for the past 2 weeks completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a burning, white-hot clarity. I tightened my grip on the handle of my heavy leather briefcase. My sensible business shoes clicked rhythmically against the polished terminal floor. Every single step I took toward the baggage claim felt like a calculated move on a chessboard. I was no longer a discarded wife. I was a senior corporate auditor hunting down a massive financial discrepancy, and my husband had just made the fatal mistake of leaving a highly visible trail. The baggage claim area was a chaotic sea of exhausted travelers crowded around the metal carousels. The mechanical hum of the conveyor belts filled the massive space, but my eyes locked onto my target immediately. Lexi was standing near carousel number 4, practically vibrating with toxic anticipation. She stood out completely from the crowd of tired business people and weary families. She was wearing a beige designer trench coat that I recognized instantly. The purchase had been flagged on our joint credit card 3 months ago. Julian had smoothly lied to my face, claiming it was an expensive gift for a female corporate investor. Clearly, the only investment he was making was in his 23-year-old public relations assistant. But the coat was absolutely nothing compared to the jewelry. Shining brilliantly against her skin was my grandmother's antique diamond necklace. Seeing it in a photograph was devastating, but seeing it in person draped carelessly around the neck of the woman who was helping destroy my marriage ignited a level of cold fury I had never experienced before. Lexi spotted me approaching through the crowd. A wide, incredibly arrogant smile stretched across her perfectly manicured face. She wanted an audience, and she was determined to get one. "Chloe," she called out loudly. Her shrill voice echoed over the mechanical noise of the terminal, deliberately drawing the attention of several people standing nearby. Travelers turned their heads, their eyes shifting back and forth between us. Lexi thrived on this kind of manufactured drama. She marched right up to me, making sure her voice carried to the onlookers. She held a thick manila envelope in her hands, like it was a grand prize trophy she had just won. "I brought your divorce papers," Lexi announced, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. "Julian wanted to make sure you received them the very second you landed. He knows how forgetful you can be at your age." She stepped directly into my personal space and shoved the heavy manila envelope hard against my chest. I did not lift my arms to take it. I simply stood perfectly still, letting my arms hang loosely at my sides. The thick packet of legal documents slid down my coat and dropped heavily onto the dirty terminal floor with a loud slap. Lexi let out a theatrical scoff. She shook her head slowly, looking me up and down with an expression of absolute disgust and pity. "Honestly, Chloe, Julian told me you had completely let yourself go, but looking at you now, I entirely understand why he had to leave. You look absolutely miserable. You look like a tired, drained office worker who buys her clothes at a discount rack. It is actually sad to look at you." A woman standing near a luggage cart shot me a look of genuine sympathy, while a businessman nearby shook his head in disgust at Lexi. Public display of cruelty. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I stepped one fraction of an inch closer to her, closing the distance between us until she was forced to look directly into my eyes. "Do not worry about the money," Lexi continued, her voice rising even higher to ensure the crowd heard her. Julian said, "If you sign those papers right now and accept the $15,000, he might throw in a few extra $100 so you can buy something decent to wear to your next job interview." I kept my voice incredibly quiet, completely composed, and utterly lethal. I am a woman who dissects risk for a living, and Lexi had absolutely no idea how much danger she was currently in. "You can tell my husband that I will not be signing his insulting settlement offer," I said calmly, my words cutting through her arrogant smirk like a surgical blade. "And while you are passing along messages, you might want to ask him for the official receipt for that diamond necklace you are currently wearing." Lexi lifted her chin proudly, her hand moving up to touch the sparkling diamonds. "He did not buy it today. It is a family heirloom. He told me I deserve to wear it because I am actually young enough to give him a real family, unlike you." I smiled. It was a tight, humorless expression that caused her arrogant grin to finally falter. "Yes, it is a family heirloom," I agreed softly. "It belonged to my late grandmother, and I filed a grand larceny police report for a stolen antique diamond necklace exactly 2 weeks ago." The color instantly drained from Lexi's face. Her hand dropped rapidly to her side as if the diamonds had suddenly caught fire and burned her skin. The arrogant posture she had carried just seconds ago vanished entirely, replaced by a sudden creeping panic. She looked around frantically as if expecting airport security to step out from behind the baggage carousel and place her in handcuffs. I leaned in just a little closer, letting my words sink deep into her mind. "I am absolutely certain you are aware that receiving stolen property is a serious state crime," I continued in the same conversational tone. "But bringing stolen property across state lines, especially high-value jewelry, elevates the crime to a federal offense. Enjoy the diamonds, Lexi. I am sure they will match your prison uniform perfectly." She took a stumbling step backward, her breath hitching in her throat. She was completely unable to stammer out a single word of defense. But before I could turn around and walk away, a massive dark shadow fell over me. Julian Private Bodyguard, a towering mountain of a man named Craig, stepped aggressively out of the crowd. Craig had always intimidated me during my marriage. He was hired specifically for his imposing physical size and his willingness to blindly follow Julian orders. He moved directly into my personal space, looming over me and crossing his massive arms over his chest. He used his sheer physical bulk to completely block my path to the exit. "You need to back off right now," Lady Craig growled. His deep voice rumbled with a clear threat of physical violence. "You are upsetting her. Mr. Julian told me to make sure you do not cause any trouble today, and he told me to make sure you pick up those papers." Craig took another step forward, forcing me to tilt my head up just to look at him. "Pick the envelope up off the floor, Chloe," he commanded roughly. "You are going to sign those papers right here, right now, or I am not letting you leave this terminal." I stood my ground. My heart was racing wildly in my chest, a rapid drumbeat of adrenaline, but I forced my facial expression to remain entirely neutral. I was completely alone in a crowded airport, facing down a man twice my size and a young woman wearing my stolen family jewelry. I clutched the handle of my briefcase, rapidly calculating my next move, refusing to show them even a single ounce of the fear they were trying to extract from me. Craig reached out his massive hand, attempting to physically force my shoulder down toward the dirty floor where the divorce papers lay. Before his heavy fingers could even brush against my coat, a sharp, rhythmic sound echoed over the mechanical noise of the baggage carousel. It was the distinct heavy strike of a wooden cane hitting the polished terminal floor. "Step away from this young woman immediately," a deep, commanding voice ordered. I turned my head and saw Marcus Sterling. He was no longer the fragile, elderly man who had suffered a medical emergency at 30,000 feet. He stood perfectly straight, leaning slightly on a polished wooden cane. He carried an aura of absolute, undeniable authority. It was the kind of quiet, immense power that commands an entire room without ever needing to shout. Craig scoffed and puffed out his chest, trying to use his physical bulk to intimidate the older man. "Mind your own business, old man," the bodyguard growled. "This is a private family matter and she needs to take her paperwork." Marcus did not flinch. He did not take a single step backward. He moved smoothly, placing himself directly between me and the towering bodyguard. He fixed his piercing gaze directly onto Craig's face, and his eyes were completely devoid of fear. It was a look of pure lethal calculation. "Placing your hands on this woman or restricting her movement in a public space constitutes criminal assault and false imprisonment under New York state law," Marcus stated. His voice was completely smooth and incredibly dangerous. "Furthermore, there are exactly 4 airport security cameras pointed directly at this specific carousel. If you do not step back this very second, I will personally ensure you are arrested, charged with a felony, and permanently stripped of your private security license. Are we absolutely clear?" Craig hesitated. The sheer, overwhelming force of Marcus' presence was completely undeniable. The massive bodyguard looked up at the security cameras mounted on the ceiling, then looked back at the unwavering stare of the elderly man. Craig swallowed hard. He immediately lowered his arms and took 3 quick steps backward, muttering a quiet apology under his breath while completely breaking eye contact. The imposing bodyguard looked suddenly very small, entirely intimidated and defeated by a man with a walking cane. Marcus turned his attention to me, his expression softening back into the kind, respectful look he had shown on the airplane. "My private car is waiting just outside at the curb. Chloe," he said gently, "please allow me to offer you a secure ride into the city. You should not have to deal with this sort of unpleasantness after such a long flight." I looked at Lexi, who was still standing completely frozen near the luggage belt. She was hyperventilating slightly, her hands rigidly clutching her coat, absolutely terrified by the sudden shift in power. I left the divorce papers lying completely ignored on the dirty floor. "Thank you, Marcus," I said gratefully. "I would appreciate that very much." We walked out the sliding glass doors into the cool, crisp New York air, leaving Lexi and the defeated bodyguard standing uselessly behind us. A sleek black town car was idling at the curb, and a professional driver instantly stepped out to open the heavy rear door for us. As I settled into the luxurious soft leather seat, the chaos of the airport vanished completely, sealed safely away behind the thick tinted glass. The vehicle pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging into the heavy city traffic. I took a deep breath, letting the chaotic adrenaline slowly settle in my chest. I did not waste a single second crying over Julian betrayal. I reached down into my leather briefcase and pulled out my laptop. I placed it firmly on my lap and opened the screen. The glowing light illuminated the dim, quiet interior of the car. Marcus watched me quietly for a moment, resting his weathered hands gently on the silver handle of his cane. "You are not going to sign those settlement papers, are you?" Marcus asked, a faint knowing smile touching his lips. I connected my laptop to my secure encrypted mobile hotspot, my fingers flying rapidly across the keyboard to initiate a deep system diagnostic. "No," I replied, my voice completely steady and cold as ice. I spent 5 years building the data compliance structure for his health technology company. I know exactly where every single digital blind spot is located. Julian wants to play arrogant games with my financial future and steal my family heritage. He is about to learn the hard way that you never declare a financial war against a senior data privacy auditor. I am going to tear his entire empire apart piece by piece. The black town car safely deposited me in front of a high-end luxury hotel in the heart of Manhattan. I thanked Marcus again for his incredible kindness and stepped out onto the busy sidewalk. The evening air was biting and served as a sharp reminder of the cold reality I was currently facing. I walked through the heavy revolving glass doors and approached the polished marble reception desk. The lobby was quiet and smelled faintly of expensive vanilla and cedar. I placed my leather briefcase on the floor and handed the young receptionist my personal credit card to book a room for the night. She swiped the card through the terminal with a polite professional smile. A loud, harsh beep echoed from the machine, and the screen flashed a bright warning in red text. The receptionist frowned slightly and tried the card a second time. The exact same error message appeared on the display. She looked up at me with a sympathetic but uncomfortable expression, gently informing me that my bank had placed a hard freeze on the account and the card was completely declined. I reached into my wallet and pulled out my secondary emergency credit card, praying that Julian had not found a way to access that specific account. The receptionist processed it, but the terminal rejected it instantly. Julian had moved much faster and far more aggressively than I had anticipated. He had systematically shut down every single financial lifeline I possessed effectively, leaving me stranded in an upscale hotel lobby with my luggage at my feet and absolutely nowhere to go. The sheer humiliation he intended for me was crystal clear. Julian wanted me to panic. He wanted me to call him in tears, begging for access to my own money so I could afford a basic place to sleep. He wanted to force me to crawl back to him and sign that insulting $15,000 settlement just to survive the week. I thanked the receptionist, quietly grabbed my briefcase, and walked right back out the revolving doors into the freezing New York night. I stood on the sidewalk as the city traffic rushed past me. I had zero cash in my pocket and my accounts were completely locked. For a brief second, a wave of genuine exhaustion threatened to pull me under. But just as I was reaching for my phone to figure out a backup plan, a sleek black Range Rover abruptly swerved out of the traffic lane. It stopped aggressively at the curb right in front of me, entirely ignoring the loud honking from a taxi behind it. The heavily tinted passenger window glided down smoothly. Sitting in the driver's seat was Maya. She was Julian's 35-year-old sister-in-law. Maya was married to Julian's older brother, but the two of them could not be more different. Maya was a stunning and incredibly sharp African-American woman who absolutely dominated the Manhattan luxury real estate market. She was currently wearing a striking crimson power suit that practically screamed authority, and she looked absolutely furious. "Get your ass in the car!" Chloe Maya commanded, her voice cutting sharply through the cold city air. "I already know exactly what that narcissistic bastard is trying to pull tonight." I did not hesitate for a single second. I opened the heavy door, tossed my briefcase onto the floorboard, and climbed into the warm, luxurious interior of the vehicle. Before I even had my seatbelt fully fastened, Maya hit the gas and merged aggressively back into the chaotic Manhattan traffic. "How did you even know I was here?" I asked, still trying to process her sudden appearance. Maya let out a harsh, bitter laugh, gripping the leather steering wheel tightly. "That idiot husband of yours cannot keep his mouth shut when he thinks he is winning. He called my husband 10 minutes ago bragging about how he just cut off all your credit cards. He actually laughed and said you were probably wandering the streets crying your eyes out." I grabbed my keys the second I heard that nonsense. I swear to God, Chloe Julian is a manipulative piece of garbage, and I am so incredibly sick of pretending otherwise at family dinners. I leaned back against the headrest, feeling an unexpected wave of relief wash over me. Maya had always been the only person in Julian's family who saw right through his manufactured charm. As a top-tier luxury real estate broker, she dealt with wealthy, arrogant men every single day, and she possessed a flawless radar for toxic behavior. "He filed the divorce papers while I was flying back from the coast," I told her quietly. "He wants to force me to take a tiny settlement, or he is going to stick me with half of his corporate debt." Maya shook her head in sheer disgust. "Do not you dare let that arrogant prick intimidate you. He is completely terrified of you, Chloe. He knows you are a brilliant data auditor, and he knows you actually built the compliance systems that keep his sketchy tech company afloat. He is trying to starve you out financially so you do not have the energy or the resources to look too closely at his recent business transactions." She navigated the heavy sports utility vehicle through the tight city streets with effortless precision. "We are going straight to my place," Maya stated firmly. "My husband is out of town on a business trip, so it is just going to be us. You have a safe place to stay, hot food to eat, and a secure internet connection. We are going to figure out exactly how to destroy his entire operation." 15 minutes later, we pulled into the secure underground parking garage of Maya's stunning high-rise apartment building. We took the private elevator straight to her penthouse loft. The space was absolutely breathtaking, featuring massive floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the glittering New York skyline. It was a true testament to Maya's immense success as an independent businesswoman, a success she built entirely on her own, without any help from Julian's family. Maya locked the heavy door behind us and immediately walked over to her large kitchen island. She did not offer me a drink or suggest we sit down to relax. Instead, she reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out a thick, glossy real estate file folder, slamming it down hard onto the marble countertop. "You said you want to look closely at his business transactions," Maya said, her eyes flashing with a fierce, predatory determination. "Then you need to start right here." I walked over to the kitchen island and stared at the heavy folder. "What exactly is this?" I asked. Maya tapped her manicured finger against the cover of the file. "It is the closing paperwork for an $8 million luxury penthouse in one of the most exclusive buildings in the city. The sale was finalized exactly 4 days ago. Julian used a highly secretive blind trust to purchase the property, completely hiding his name from the public records. But he is a complete idiot who forgets that I have exclusive access to the private broker registry. I saw the routing numbers. I know he bought that penthouse for his little 23-year-old public relations assistant." I stared at the file as the final pieces of his massive betrayal began to fall perfectly into place. "He just told the federal courts he is completely broke and filing for bankruptcy to avoid paying you a fair settlement." Maya continued, her voice dropping into a dangerous whisper. "But he just spent $8 million in cold hard cash to buy a luxury property for his mistress. You are the data privacy auditor, Chloe. You tell me. Where exactly does a bankrupt tech executive suddenly find $8 million in untraceable cash?" I reached out and opened the heavy real estate folder. The sheer audacity of his crime was staring right back at me. He had made a catastrophic mistake, and with Maya's help I was finally ready to tear his life apart. I stared at the heavy real estate folder resting on Maya's marble countertop. The sheer audacity of his crime was staring right back at me. Julian had explicitly stated in his brutal text message that his health technology company was currently drowning in a massive $5 million corporate debt. He was using that fabricated debt as a weapon to force me into a tiny $15,000 divorce settlement. He wanted me to believe he was entirely bankrupt and desperate. But the glossy paperwork sitting in front of me told a completely different story. According to the certified broker documents Maya had pulled from the private registry, Julian had just authorized a wire transfer for an $8 million luxury penthouse. He purchased it entirely in cold, hard cash. He registered the property under a highly secretive blind trust to completely mask his identity, and then he basically handed the keys directly to Lexi. Where exactly does a bankrupt tech executive suddenly find $8 million in untraceable liquid cash? I repeated Maya's question out loud. My mind was already racing, analyzing every single financial structure I had ever built for his company. He did not get a corporate loan. No reputable bank would ever approve that kind of capital for a failing startup. And he certainly did not have legitimate venture capital funding hidden away in a secret account. Maya crossed her arms and leaned against the counter. "That is exactly what you need to find out, Chloe. because if he is hiding that kind of money, he is committing massive federal fraud during an active divorce proceeding. I did not waste another second. I grabbed my leather briefcase from the floor and pulled out my laptop. I set it down next to the real estate folder and powered it on. I asked Maya for her secure wireless internet password. While she typed it in, she walked over to her espresso machine to make us both a strong cup of coffee. We were going to be awake for a very long time. I am the senior data privacy auditor for his entire corporate network, I explained to Maya as my screen illuminated the dark kitchen. I built the exact compliance systems his company uses to protect highly sensitive medical data. I know every single digital backdoor, every proxy server, and every hidden administrative override. Julian thought he was a genius for freezing my personal bank accounts, but he was incredibly foolish to leave my corporate access credentials active. I opened a secure encrypted terminal and bypassed the basic security firewall of his company. I took the routing numbers Maya had highlighted in the penthouse closing paperwork and ran them through a deep forensic tracing algorithm. The digital paper trail was complex. It was deliberately designed to confuse a standard accountant. The money had moved through 3 different shell companies located in the Caribbean before being converted into anonymous cryptocurrency wallets. But Julian was not dealing with a standard accountant. He was dealing with me. I tracked the cryptocurrency conversions backward, matching the digital timestamps with the internal financial ledgers of his health technology startup. When the final decryption sequence completed, the massive hidden truth finally appeared on my screen. I felt the breath completely leave my lungs. "Oh my God," I whispered, staring at the cascading lines of code. Maya rushed over with 2 mugs of black coffee, setting them down quickly. "What is it? What did you find, Chloe?" I pointed a trembling finger at the screen. "He did not just embezzle corporate funds, Maya. It is so much worse than that. Julian Health Technology Startup manages highly confidential medical records for thousands of patients across the country. I just traced the origin of the $8 million. He illegally bypassed the security protocols I built. He extracted massive packets of sensitive patient health data and sold them on the black market to unregulated third-party data brokers." Maya gasped, her eyes widening in absolute horror. "He sold patient medical records. That is a massive federal crime. The Department of Justice will absolutely destroy him for that. I used the illegal profits from the data sale to funnel money into the offshore cryptocurrency wallets." I continued, my voice growing colder with every single word. "Then he used that clean laundered money to fund the blind trust and buy the penthouse for Lexi. He is running a massive data trafficking and money laundering operation right under everyone's noses." I clicked on the specific digital registration file for the blind trust that held the penthouse. I wanted to see exactly how he structured the corporate officers to hide his direct involvement. As the official document loaded on my screen, a sickening wave of pure dread washed over me. My name was listed at the very top of the document. Julian had completely forged my digital signature. He had deliberately listed me, his senior data privacy auditor wife, as the sole chief privacy officer and primary financial guarantor of the fraudulent blind trust. "He framed me," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Maya looked at the screen and let out a string of angry curses. Julian knew exactly what he was doing. If the federal government or the FBI ever audited his company and discovered the illegal sale of patient medical records, Julian could claim he knew absolutely nothing about it. He had intentionally engineered a perfect digital paper trail that pointed directly to me. He was going to let me take the total fall for his federal crimes and spend the rest of my life in a federal penitentiary while he lived in a luxury penthouse with his mistress. The sheer absolute evil of his plan was almost impossible to comprehend. He did not just want to leave me broke. He wanted to use me as his ultimate human shield. Suddenly, a bright red warning banner flashed violently across my laptop screen. A loud digital alarm chimed from the speakers. "What is that?" Maya asked, stepping back in sudden alarm. "It is an active system override," I said, my hands flying across the keyboard to trace the incoming connection. Julian Internal Security System just flagged my intrusion. He knows someone is inside the corporate network downloading the offshore ledgers. I watched the screen as an active location trace initiated. He was bouncing the signal, trying to pinpoint my exact physical location. I quickly executed a kill switch command to sever the connection, but it was exactly 3 seconds too late. The tracking protocol completed. "He knows where we are," I told Maya, slamming the laptop shut. He knows I am accessing the network from your apartment building. Maya Zhao tightened. Her expression shifted from shock to absolute warrior mode. Let him try to come here, she challenged, walking over to her smart home security panel. I will have the building concierge throw his arrogant self right out into the street. But Julian was not going to come here himself. He was going to send someone far worse to silence me before I could ever expose his crimes to a judge. I slammed the laptop shut just as the trace completed, but my heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Maya stood near the kitchen island, her expression shifting from shock to absolute determination. We both knew Julian would not come here himself. He was a coward who hid behind expensive lawyers and private security. But knowing we had a brief window before he escalated his attack, I realized I needed serious legal guidance. I needed someone who understood the intricate layers of federal law, someone who could help me weaponize the digital evidence I was about to uncover. I pulled my phone from my pocket and retrieved the business card the elderly man from the airplane had given me. Marcus Sterling. I did not fully understand his true power yet, but his razor-sharp intellect during that medical emergency told me everything I needed to know. I dialed the number, praying he was still awake. He answered on the second ring. His voice was calm, steady, and completely devoid of sleep. I quickly explained the situation. I told him about the frozen accounts, the stolen diamond necklace, and the $8 million penthouse purchased through a blind trust. I told him I was about to execute a deep forensic dive into my husband's corporate network, but I needed to know exactly how to preserve the evidence so a judge could not throw it out. Marcus instructed me to switch to a secure encrypted video call. A moment later, his face appeared on my laptop screen. He was sitting in a dimly lit study surrounded by towering bookshelves looking incredibly sharp. He told me that in order to make the evidence stick in a federal court, I had to establish a flawless chain of custody. He ordered me to record my screen document every single IP address I routed through and create a digital signature for every file I downloaded. He said we were no longer fighting a divorce case. We were building a federal indictment. With Marcus watching through the webcam and Maya standing guard near the penthouse windows, the longest night of my life officially began. I reopened my laptop and connected to a virtual private network, masking my location through a dozen international servers. I took a deep breath and plunged straight into the dark architecture of Julian Health Technology startup. I had spent 3 grueling years building the data compliance protocols for that company. I knew the system better than the engineers who currently maintained it. I bypassed the outer firewall with a legacy administrative credential I had buried deep in the code years ago. Once inside the main server, the sheer volume of data was overwhelming. I navigated through the financial ledgers, searching for the massive void where the $8 million had originated. The official accounting books were perfectly balanced. To a standard auditor, Julian Company looked like a struggling but legitimate startup. But I am not a standard auditor. I know that when wealthy criminals want to hide massive amounts of capital, they do not touch the main ledger. They create a shadow system. I ran a deep forensics tracing algorithm scanning for irregular data packets moving outside of standard business hours. It took nearly 3 hours of grueling concentration. The coffee in my mug grew ice cold. The glowing light of the screen burned my eyes, but I refused to blink. At exactly 3 a.m, my algorithm caught a massive digital anomaly. I found a hidden server pathway that was completely isolated from the main corporate network. It was protected by military-grade encryption, but Julian had made a fatal, arrogant mistake. He had reused a portion of his old password matrix. I cracked the encryption within 20 minutes. As the hidden server finally opened on my screen, I felt the air completely leave the room. Marcus leaned closer to his webcam, his eyes narrowing. He asked what I was looking at, his voice sharp and commanding. I could barely force the words out of my throat. I told him I was looking at a massive data breach, my hands trembling over the keyboard. I explained that it was not an external hack, but an inside job. I clicked on the first batch of compressed files. They were not financial records. They were highly confidential patient medical files. Julian Company had recently secured a contract to manage the database for a massive chain of private hospitals on the East Coast. I had personally set up the secure portal to ensure patient privacy was strictly maintained under federal law. Julian had completely weaponized my work. He had secretly installed an automated script that bypassed my security protocols and continuously scraped the hospital database. He was stealing everything. I scrolled through the horrifying lists. Diagnoses, social security numbers, private insurance payouts, psychiatric evaluations, and prescription histories. Thousands upon thousands of innocent people had their most intimate secrets compromised. Maya gasped, stepping up right behind my chair and staring at the screen in absolute disgust. She asked if he was stealing medical records, her voice shaking with anger. She demanded to know why he would do something so completely evil. I explained that unregulated data brokers pay an absolute fortune for verified medical profiles, feeling a sickening wave of pure revulsion wash over me. Pharmaceutical marketing firms, identity thieves, and malicious offshore entities buy this data to exploit vulnerable patients. Julian did not just embezzle corporate funds. He was actively running a massive data trafficking operation. I traced the automated script to see where the stolen patient data was being sent. It was routed to a series of anonymous servers located in Eastern Europe. But I needed to follow the money. I needed to prove how the sale of these stolen records connected directly back to the $8 million penthouse. I initiated a blockchain tracking program. Whenever the foreign data brokers purchased a batch of stolen medical records, they paid Julian in cryptocurrency. They used Bitcoin and Ethereum to completely mask the transactions. Julian then took that digital currency and tumbled it through dozens of decentralized exchanges, mixing the dirty money with legitimate trading volume to wash away the digital fingerprints. It was a highly sophisticated money laundering scheme. But every digital transaction leaves a microscopic footprint if you know exactly where to look. I spent the next 2 hours meticulously untangling the web of cryptocurrency transfers. I mapped out the exact flow of the laundered money. I watched the screen as the funds moved from the dark web exchanges into a private offshore banking account located in the Cayman Islands. From that secure offshore account, the clean money was wired directly into the blind trust Julian had established in New York. The exact same blind trust that was used to purchase the luxury penthouse for his 23-year-old mistress. I exported the entire tracing map into a secure document. It clearly showed the undeniable path of the money. From stolen patient medical records to offshore cryptocurrency wallets to the Cayman Islands, and finally to the real estate broker who handed Lexi the keys to the penthouse. The sheer magnitude of the crime was almost impossible to process. Julian had betrayed the trust of thousands of innocent patients just to fund his lavish lifestyle and his infidelity. He had built his entire arrogant empire on a foundation of absolute cruelty and federal fraud. I looked at Marcus on the video screen. The retired law professor was sitting perfectly still, his face a mask of cold, lethal calculation. He had been taking meticulous notes throughout my entire digital investigation. I addressed him directly, stating that we now had absolute proof of severe federal wire fraud, mass data theft, and international money laundering. Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes burning with an intense, fierce light. He told me I had done extraordinary work tonight, his voice carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of absolute authority. He said my husband believed he was untouchable because he operated in the shadows, but I had just dragged his entire operation into the blinding light. He leaned forward, looking directly into the camera. He instructed me to print every single document and create 2 separate encrypted hard drives with the digital evidence. He warned me that tomorrow Julian was going to attempt to force me into submission at his lawyer office. Julian was going to use his fabricated corporate debt to terrorize me. Marcus told me to walk into that room and let Julian believe he had won. I needed to let him put his arrogance fully on display. I stared at the screen, a new surge of adrenaline fighting off the deep exhaustion in my bones. I promised Marcus that I was going to completely destroy Julian, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. Marcus offered a tight, dangerous smile. He corrected me, stating that we were going to ensure Julian never saw the outside of a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. He told me to get some rest because tomorrow the real war would finally begin. The video call disconnected, leaving the screen dark. I sat in the quiet penthouse watching the morning sun slowly begin to rise over the Manhattan skyline. The city was waking up completely unaware of the massive storm that was about to break. Maya placed a gentle, supportive hand on my shoulder. We had the ultimate weapon. Now we just needed the perfect moment to completely decimate his life. I felt a sudden cold chill run down my spine as I expanded the master corporate filings for the blind trust holding the penthouse. Tracking the flow of dirty cryptocurrency through offshore accounts was shocking enough, but what I discovered next was an absolute nightmare that made my blood run completely ice cold. My eyes locked onto the primary executive registry page. Julian had not merely listed my name as a secondary contact or a passive beneficiary. He had executed a flawless digital forgery of my official cryptographic signature. He had used my private security tokens credentials I had created during our marriage for routine administrative tasks to systematically appoint me as the chief privacy officer and sole managing director of the fraudulent entity. The sheer calculated evil of his scheme hit me with devastating force. Julian had engineered a masterclass in corporate scapegoating. He knew that an offshore data trafficking operation carrying millions of dollars in illegal cryptocurrency would eventually attract the attention of federal regulators. If the Department of Justice or the FBI ever initiated an investigation into the stolen patient records, the paper trail he created would lead investigators directly to my doorstep. I was a senior data privacy auditor. On paper, I possessed the exact technical expertise required to build a dark web data pipeline and wash the proceeds through offshore trusts. Julian had designed the entire legal framework of his crime to ensure that when the hammer of the law finally fell, it would crush me instead of him. He was prepared to let the woman who had financed his early career spend the next 20 years in a federal prison while he walked away with his freedom and his mistress. I pointed at the glowing screen, my voice trembling with a mixture of sheer rage and disbelief. I told Maya to look closely at the primary guarantor line. I explained that he had forged my digital signature on the blind trust documents. I told her that if federal agents raided that penthouse tomorrow, every single piece of evidence would brand me as the mastermind behind the entire laundering scheme. Maya leaned over my shoulder, her eyes widening in absolute horror as she read the legal details. She let out a sharp, furious gasp, her hands balling into tight fists at her sides. She swore under her breath, completely disgusted by the sheer malignancy of her brother-in-law actions. She told me that Julian was not just a cheating scoundrel, but a sociopath who was actively setting me up to take the fall for his federal crimes. I stared at my forged signature glowing on the laptop display, but I forced the panic rising in my chest to dissolve into an icy, calculating resolve. Julian had relied on my technical skills to build his company, and now he was relying on my silence to cover his tracks. But he had fundamentally forgotten one crucial fact. I was the one who understood the digital architecture better than anyone else. I immediately began compiling the exact system timestamps, server access logs, and device hardware signatures that would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that my digital signature had been used without my knowledge from his personal home office computer. He thought he had trapped me in a nightmare, but he had actually handed me the ultimate weapon to destroy him. The sun was just starting to rise over the Manhattan skyline, casting a pale golden light across the expensive marble floors of the penthouse. I had spent the entire night compiling the digital evidence, saving every single encrypted file onto 2 separate hardware flash drives. My eyes were burning from sheer exhaustion, but the adrenaline rushing through my veins kept me completely alert. We finally had the absolute proof we needed to destroy his entire fraudulent empire. Just as I reached for my cold cup of coffee to take a sip, a piercing digital siren erupted violently from my laptop speakers. The entire screen instantly flashed a blinding, aggressive red. The sudden noise was so loud it echoed off the high ceilings of the luxury apartment. Maya jumped backward, nearly dropping her own mug on the floor. She demanded to know what was happening as she rushed over to the kitchen island to look at the glowing screen. I slammed my hands onto the keyboard, typing furiously to intercept the incoming command. "It is a hostile counter-breach," I explained, my voice tight with rising panic. Julian internal security team just woke up and ran a morning diagnostic. They found the legacy backdoor I used to download the offshore financial ledgers. They are actively pinging my location right now. I watched the digital map on my screen as a hostile tracking algorithm bounced rapidly across local internet service providers. I desperately tried to initiate an emergency kill switch to sever the connection entirely, but the hostile script was incredibly aggressive. A glowing green location pin dropped precisely onto our grid coordinates in the heart of the city. "They have our exact physical location," I told Maya, feeling a cold, heavy knot of dread form deep in my stomach. "Julian knows I am accessing the network from inside your building." Almost immediately, my cell phone vibrated aggressively on the marble countertop. The screen lit up with a new text message from Julian. I read the cruel words aloud to Maya. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Chloe. I am sending Craig to pick up my stolen corporate property right now. Open the door when he gets there and do not make this harder than it has to be." Maya did not hesitate for a single second. The fierce luxury real estate broker immediately shifted into absolute survival mode. She grabbed her smartphone and dialed the front desk of her highly secure building. "This is Maya in Penthouse 4, she commanded, her voice radiating absolute, unquestionable authority. "I am expecting a hostile, unauthorized visitor. He is a large, aggressive man named Craig. If he steps 1 foot inside this lobby, you are to deny him entry, lock down the private elevators, and call the police immediately. Do you understand me?" While Maya handled the physical perimeter of the building, I knew I had to protect our only legal leverage. If Julian, massive bodyguard, managed to break through those doors and destroy my laptop, Julian would walk away completely free. He would wipe his corporate servers before I ever got the chance to speak to a judge. I quickly pulled the 2 encrypted hardware drives from the ports and shoved them deep into the inner pockets of my tailored suit jacket. I immediately executed a rapid military-grade wipe protocol on my laptop, permanently destroying the local hard drive so the machine would be completely useless if confiscated. We stood in the quiet kitchen, catching our breath and waiting for the building concierge to call us back and confirm that the bodyguard had been handled. We assumed the multi-million-dollar security system of the luxury high-rise would keep us completely safe. But Julian was a man who thrived on manipulation and corruption. He did not just send a brute-force bodyguard to handle a delicate situation. A loud, aggressive pounding suddenly echoed from the heavy mahogany front door of the penthouse. Maya and I completely froze, exchanging a terrified look. The concierge had not called up to warn us. The private elevator had not chimed. Whoever was standing on the other side of that door had completely bypassed the building security and made it directly to our floor. The conflict was no longer just digital, it was standing right on our doorstep. The loud, aggressive pounding echoed again against the heavy mahogany door. Maya and I exchanged a tense look before she walked cautiously over to the security monitor mounted on the wall. She looked at the digital screen and let out a sharp gasp. It was not Julian, massive bodyguard standing in the hallway. It was a man in an expensive tailored suit standing right next to 2 uniformed New York City police officers. I walked over to the monitor and felt my blood run cold for a brief second. "I know exactly who that is," I whispered to Maya. It was Richard Cross. Julian had retained the most vicious and highly connected corporate lawyer in all of Manhattan. Richard was a man widely known in the financial sector for using completely ruthless and borderline illegal intimidation tactics to crush his opponents before they ever reached a courtroom. Having police officers with him was exactly how he managed to completely bypass the strict security protocols in the lobby. Maya narrowed her eyes and unlocked the deadbolt. She pulled the heavy door open just a few inches, keeping her body firmly blocking the entrance. She demanded to know exactly why the police were standing in her private hallway at the crack of dawn. Richard Cross pushed his way forward, stepping aggressively into the doorway. He had perfectly slicked back hair and wore a predatory smile that made my skin completely crawl. He smoothly informed Maya that the officers were simply there to keep the peace while he served official legal documents on behalf of his client. Richard looked right past Maya and locked his cold, dead eyes directly onto me. He held up a thick stack of legal papers and declared that he was holding an emergency temporary restraining order. He claimed it had been signed by a local judge just an hour ago, and it explicitly barred me from coming within 500 feet of Julian or any of his corporate assets. But the slick corporate lawyer was not finished. He stepped even closer, his voice dropping into a menacing theatrical whisper intended to terrify me. He accused me of executing a malicious and highly illegal cyber intrusion. He said Julian Internal Security Team had logged my exact unauthorized entry into their private corporate network just moments ago. He called my actions an act of severe corporate espionage and federal data theft. I stood my ground, completely maintaining my composure. I felt the cold, heavy weight of the 2 encrypted hardware drives resting safely inside the inner pockets of my tailored suit jacket. I did not say a single word. I simply let him talk, allowing him to expose exactly how desperate Julian actually was. Richard smiled broadly, mistakenly interpreting my absolute silence as sheer terror. He told me that unauthorized access to a medical technology server was a severe federal offense. He threatened to call the state financial licensing board the very second his office opened for business. He swore he would personally ensure my senior auditing license was permanently revoked before I even ate lunch. He promised that I would never work in the financial sector ever again. He said he would make sure I spent the next decade drowning in endless legal debt just trying to keep myself out of a federal penitentiary. The two police officers stood silently behind him, their hands resting casually near their duty belts. They were clearly unaware that they were being used as expensive props in a massive corporate extortion scheme. They were just following the paperwork Richard had completely fabricated or aggressively pushed through a corrupt local judge. Then came the ultimate demand. Richard pulled a sleek, expensive silver pen from his jacket pocket and tapped it aggressively against the legal documents in his hand. He told me I had exactly 12 hours to make the most important decision of my entire life. He ordered me to show up at his downtown law firm at exactly 4 o'clock this afternoon for the mandatory divorce mediation. He dictated my future with absolute arrogance. He said I was going to sit down at his mahogany conference table, pick up a pen, and sign the $15,000 settlement agreement without saying a single word of complaint. If I signed the papers and walked away completely empty-handed, he promised Julian would kindly drop the cyber intrusion charges and let me keep my freedom. But if I refused, or if I tried to fight them in court tomorrow morning, he would instruct these police officers to return and arrest me for felony data theft. He shoved the restraining order hard into my chest, forcing me to take the papers. He gave me one last arrogant smirk, tipped his head mockingly toward Maya, and turned to walk back down the carpeted hallway with his police escort. Maya slammed the heavy door shut and immediately locked the deadbolt. She turned to me, her chest heaving with anger and fear. She asked me what we were going to do. She was terrified that they actually had the power to take away my entire career and send me to prison. I looked down at the fabricated restraining order in my hands. The paper was practically vibrating with their underlying desperation. I analyzed the situation with the cold logic of an auditor. If they truly had the absolute power to destroy me, they would have just instructed the police to arrest me right then and there. But they did not. They offered me a deal because they were absolutely terrified of what I might have downloaded from their servers. I calmly tossed the legal documents directly into the kitchen trash can. I looked at Maya and let out a soft, genuine laugh. I told her that Richard Cross just made a massive tactical error. I told her we were going to get dressed in our absolute best power suits. I was going to accept his invitation and walk right into the lion den. But I was not bringing a pen to sign a settlement. I was bringing a digital bomb that would blow their entire corrupt empire into a million pieces. The heavy silence in the penthouse was suddenly broken by my own soft laughter. Maya stared at me as if the extreme stress of the morning had finally caused my mind to snap entirely. She stood near the marble kitchen island, gripping her empty coffee mug, and asked me how I could possibly be smiling after a corrupt lawyer just threatened to completely destroy my career and send me to a federal penitentiary. I turned away from the kitchen trash can, where the fabricated restraining order now sat crumpled among the discarded coffee filters. I looked directly at Maya and explained that Richard Cross had just made a catastrophic mistake. He had revealed their entire hand. I told her that men who hold real absolute power do not need to show up at your front door at 6 in the morning with police escorts and theatrical threats. They simply destroy you quietly in the dark. Julian and his lawyer were actively panicking. They knew I had been inside the corporate server, but they had absolutely no idea how much data I had managed to extract before they severed the connection. The 12-hour deadline was not an ultimatum. I explained to Maya, feeling a surge of pure adrenaline replace my exhaustion. It was a desperate countdown. They needed me to sit down at that mahogany conference table and sign away all my legal rights before I had enough time to thoroughly analyze the digital files I had downloaded. They were trying to blindfold me before I could see the truth. Instead of feeling the crippling terror they intended to inflict, I felt a profound sense of absolute clarity. I walked back to my leather bag and pulled out a sleek silver titanium flash drive. It was a custom military-grade encrypted USB drive that required a complex alphanumeric sequence and biometric fingerprint verification to unlock. I plugged it into Maya's personal computer, utilizing a secure offline environment, so Julian tracking algorithms could not detect the data transfer. I carefully selected and transferred the most lethal pieces of digital evidence onto the small silver drive. I loaded the offshore routing numbers, the cryptocurrency ledgers, and the horrifying logs of the stolen patient medical records. Finally, I copied the corporate registration documents for the blind trust, making sure to completely highlight the forged digital signature Julian had used to frame me as his chief privacy officer. This tiny piece of metal now held enough explosive evidence to dismantle a multi-million-dollar health technology company and send my cheating husband to federal prison for decades. I safely ejected the USB drive and held it up to the morning light. I slipped the drive into the pocket of my trousers, feeling its solid, cold weight against my hip. It was the ultimate legal leverage. Maya walked over to her massive walk-in closet and emerged holding a stunning tailored charcoal gray suit. She handed it to me, stating that if I was going to walk into a room full of arrogant corporate sharks, I needed to wear the appropriate armor. She told me the suit was imported from Italy and commanded absolute, unquestionable respect. I thanked her, feeling a deep surge of genuine gratitude for her unwavering support during the darkest night of my entire life. As I was changing into the sharp, elegant clothing, my cell phone vibrated quietly on the marble kitchen counter. I picked it up and saw a secure encrypted text message from Marcus Sterling. The retired federal judge had been silently calculating our next move ever since our video call ended hours ago. I read his message carefully, letting his strategic brilliance guide my final steps. Marcus instructed me to ignore every single standard legal instinct. He explicitly told me not to hire a defense attorney and not to bring any legal representation to the mediation at the downtown law firm this afternoon. He wrote that Julian and Richard Cross were arrogant predators who fed on intimidation and fear. If I walked into that high-rise conference room completely alone, they would automatically assume I was defeated, broken, and too terrified to fight back. He wanted me to feed their massive egos and let them lower their defenses entirely. The final line of his text message sent a fierce thrill of anticipation straight through my veins. Marcus wrote that I should let them believe I was completely isolated in this fight. He promised that while they were busy threatening me in the boardroom, he would be waiting quietly at the federal courthouse, preparing the absolute destruction of their entire empire. I deleted the message immediately, ensuring no trace of our communication remained on the device. I looked at myself in the large hallway mirror. The charcoal gray suit fit perfectly, projecting an image of cold, professional authority. The exhausted, terrified woman who had been kicked out of her own home just 24 hours ago was completely gone. In her place stood a razor-sharp data auditor holding a loaded digital weapon. I turned to Maya and told her it was finally time to go. We were going to let Julian believe he had successfully cornered his prey. We were going to let him sit at the head of the table and gloat about his flawless victory. But the exact moment he demanded my signature on those divorce papers, I was going to drop the encrypted flash drive right onto his expensive wooden table and watch his entire corrupt world burn to the ground. The elevator ride to the 50th floor of the downtown legal district skyscraper was entirely silent. My ears popped subtly as the high-speed carriage climbed higher into the Manhattan skyline, leaving the chaotic noise of the city streets far below. When the sleek silver doors finally glided open, I stepped out into the immaculate reception area of Richard Cross and Associates. The entire floor was designed to intimidate. The walls were made of floor-to-ceiling frosted glass, and the floors were cut from thick slabs of imported black marble. It was a legal fortress built on corporate ruthlessness, intimidation, and expensive billable hours. I walked past the reception desk without offering a single word and made my way down the long, brightly lit corridor. My charcoal gray suit felt like a flawless suit of armor. I could feel the cold, heavy weight of the encrypted titanium flash drive resting securely in my tailored pocket. Every single step I took felt deliberate and carefully calculated. I was walking directly into a trap they had carefully set for me, but they had absolutely no idea that I was the one bringing the lethal poison. At the very end of the hallway, a set of massive double oak doors stood wide open. I stepped into the sprawling corner boardroom. The space was dominated by an enormous polished mahogany conference table that stretched nearly 20 feet long across the center of the room. Behind the table, a wall of pure glass offered a dizzying panoramic view of the entire city. And sitting on the opposite side of that massive table, basking in the afternoon sunlight, was the trio of people who genuinely believed they had successfully ruined my life. Julian sat directly in the center leather chair, looking like a man who had already conquered the entire world. He was wearing a brand new navy blue custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than the meager settlement he was offering me. Beside him sat Lexi. The sheer audacity of bringing his 23-year-old mistress to his own divorce mediation was staggering, but it was exactly the kind of psychological warfare Julian loved to play. Lexi was wearing a designer silk blouse, and I immediately noticed the heavy diamond tennis bracelet glittering on her wrist. I recognized the jewelry instantly. It was purchased with the laundered money from the Blind Trust. Flanking Julian on the left was Richard Cross. The slick corporate lawyer leaned back in his expensive chair, resting his steepled fingers against his chin. As I walked further into the room, all three of them stopped talking and turned their undivided attention toward me. Richard immediately scanned the empty space behind me, looking for my legal representation. When he realized I was completely alone, a slow, predatory smile spread across his sharp face. Julian let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed off the glass walls. He leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the mahogany table. "Look who decided to show up," he sneered, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "And you came all by yourself." "What happened, Chloe? Could you not find a single low-rent public defender willing to take on a massive cyber espionage case? Or did you finally realize that hiring a lawyer would just be a massive waste of my money?" Lexi giggled softly, covering her mouth with a perfectly manicured hand. She leaned closer to Julian, whispering something in his ear that made him smirk even wider. I ignored her completely. I did not break my stride until I reached the opposite side of the table. I remained standing, refusing to sit down in the plush leather chair they had designated for me. I wanted to force them to look up at me. Richard Cross let out a dramatic sigh and opened a thick leather binder in front of him. "Let us skip the pleasantries, Chloe," he said, his voice flat and purely transactional. "You are standing in my office right now because you are completely out of options. You have no money, you have no legal counsel, and as of this morning you have a pending federal cyber intrusion charge hanging directly over your head. I suggest you sit down and listen very carefully to the generous offer my client is willing to make before he changes his mind and sends you to prison." Richard reached into the leather binder and pulled out a single crisp piece of paper. He placed his hand flat on top of the document and slid it aggressively across the smooth, polished mahogany wood. The paper stopped exactly 1 inch from my fingertips. It was a printed cashier check. I looked down at the bold numbers. $15,000. It was a pathetic, insulting fraction of the massive wealth we had built together over the last 7 years. It was significantly less money than Julian spent on a single weekend getaway with his mistress. "That is your entire exit package," Richard stated coldly, tapping his expensive silver pen against the table. $15,000 free and clear. You sign the non-disclosure agreement, you sign the divorce decree, and you walk out of this building today with your freedom. If you refuse to sign that paper right now, the offer drops to absolute zero, and I make a single phone call to the district attorney. We will have you arrested for felony data theft before you even reach the elevator lobby." I kept my expression completely neutral. I looked at the insulting check and then slowly lifted my gaze to meet Julian's eyes. He was practically vibrating with arrogant triumph. He honestly believed he had flawlessly executed his master plan to completely erase me from his life. "Take the money and disappear, Chloe." Julian commanded, his tone shifting from mocking to violently aggressive. "You are entirely irrelevant now. You were useful when I needed someone to sit in a dark room and write compliance codes, but my company has evolved way beyond your limited capabilities. You are just a number-crunching bean counter. You do not understand how real business operates at this level. You do not understand vision or ambition." Julian stood up from his leather chair, walking slowly toward the massive glass window to look out over the city. He could not resist the urge to brag. His massive ego required a captive audience, and he wanted me to fully understand exactly how much power I was losing by walking away. "Tomorrow morning I am going on national television," he announced, puffing out his chest with sheer pride. "I am sitting down for an exclusive primetime interview on a major financial news network. I am officially announcing that my health technology firm just secured a massive multi-million-dollar federal contract with the Department of Veterans Affairs. We are going to be managing the highly secure medical data for thousands of military veterans across the entire country. The federal government is officially backing my company, Chloe. I am about to become a billionaire, and you are going to be absolutely nothing." He turned back to face me, pointing an accusing finger directly in my direction. "I am the brilliant genius who built this empire," he shouted, his voice echoing in the large room. You just sat in the background checking regulatory boxes and writing boring privacy protocols. You thought you could audit me. You thought you could dig into my private corporate ledgers and find something to use against me in court. But you are completely out of your league. I am entirely untouchable. The government is literally handing me the keys to their largest medical database tomorrow morning. Lexi smiled brightly, tracing the expensive diamonds on her wrist with her fingers. Julian is moving on to much bigger things, she chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy and condescension. You should just take the check, Chloe. Start over somewhere else. Maybe find a nice, quiet accounting job in the suburbs where you do not have to worry about complex corporate structures and high-stakes business deals. The sheer profound irony of their arrogant words was almost beautiful. Julian was bragging about securing a massive federal contract to manage highly classified government medical records while actively running a black market data trafficking ring using the exact same systems. He was already selling out the private records of civilian patients, and now he was actively planning to steal and sell the medical data of vulnerable military veterans. He was handing me the final heavy nail for his own coffin on a silver platter. He was giving me everything I needed to destroy him on a national scale. Richard Cross checked his heavy gold watch and tapped the mahogany table impatiently. The clock is ticking, Chloe, he warned sharply. My patience is officially exhausted. Pick up the pen, sign the legal documents, take the check, and get out of my office before I ruin the rest of your pathetic life. I stood perfectly still in the quiet boardroom. I did not reach for the expensive silver pen. I did not touch the insulting $15,000 check. I let the silence stretch out, allowing their arrogant words to hang heavily in the cold air conditioning of the room. I looked directly at Julian. I looked at Lexi. I looked at Richard Cross. They had painted a magnificent, glorious picture of their invincible and wealthy future. They thought they had completely broken my spirit. They thought they had won the war. Now it was my turn to show them exactly how easily a simple bean counter could tear their entire corrupt empire to the ground. I did not reach for the expensive silver pen. I did not look down at the insulting $15,000 check sitting inches from my hand. Instead, I maintained eye contact with Julian and slowly reached into the inner pocket of my tailored charcoal gray suit. I pulled out a crisp, thick packet of forensic financial documents and dropped them right on top of his check, completely covering the paper with hard, undeniable facts. Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He squinted down at the papers, his arrogant expression shifting into sudden confusion. He asked what pathetic game I was trying to play now. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, cold authority of a senior data auditor delivering a final performance review. I told him to look at the top page of the financial statement. I explained that it was the complete blockchain audit trail, tracking the exact movement of the $8 million used to purchase the luxury penthouse for his mistress. I detailed how the money originated from the illegal sale of stolen patient medical records through offshore cryptocurrency wallets into the Cayman Islands, and finally into his secret blind trust. The color drained completely from Julian's face. The arrogant swagger he had worn just a moment ago vanished into thin air. He stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the mahogany table for physical support. He looked down at the precise routing numbers and the time-stamped transaction hashes, realizing with absolute terror that I had successfully mapped out his entire criminal operation. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a strangled gasp came out. His multi-million-dollar empire, his upcoming national television interview, and his untouchable corporate persona were suddenly crashing down around him in real time. Lexi let out a sharp, nervous sound of panic, her manicured hands flying up to cover her mouth as she stared at Julian in absolute shock. For 3 agonizing seconds, total silence filled the massive glass boardroom. Julian was completely paralyzed, unable to defend himself against the crushing weight of his own crimes. But Richard Cross was not a top-tier corporate defense lawyer for nothing. The slick attorney did not panic. He did not even flinch. While Julian was drowning in his own sudden terror, Richard reacted with cold, calculated, predatory speed. Richard slammed his palm down hard onto the polished mahogany wood, breaking the heavy silence. A dangerous, sharp smile spread across his face as he shifted into full combat mode. Richard leaned forward, resting his weight on his forearms, and looked directly at me with absolute contempt. He stated that these papers were nothing more than a pathetic collection of forged documents and stolen data files. He smoothly claimed that I had used my administrative access to execute an unauthorized cyber intrusion into his client corporate network, committing severe corporate espionage and grand larceny. He declared that even if my little fairy tale financial trail were somehow real, it was completely inadmissible in any court of law because it was obtained through illegal hacking. Richard twisted the narrative with terrifying legal precision. He looked right at Julian, who was desperately trying to regain his composure, and then back at me. He announced that I had not exposed a crime. I had manufactured one. He claimed that I was the rogue employee who orchestrated the data breach behind Julian, back using forged credentials to frame my own husband out of bitter divorce spite. Richard picked up the financial packet I had dropped and tossed it casually into the trash can, as if it were worthless garbage. He told me my little stunt was cute, but it completely failed. He reminded me that I had 12 hours to sign the original settlement, or he would personally ensure the federal authorities arrested me for felony data theft before the sun went down. I watched Richard smooth down his lapels, completely unfazed by his aggressive counterattack. They thought they could bury the truth under a mountain of threats and legal gymnastics, but they had no idea that I was just getting started. Richard Cross did not just dismiss the documents. He let out a low, dark chuckle that slowly grew into a loud, theatrical laugh, echoing sharply off the cold glass walls of the massive boardroom. He shook his head with exaggerated pity, acting as if he were dealing with a deeply confused and stubborn child, rather than a seasoned corporate auditor. He reached his hand out and tapped his expensive silver pen against the polished mahogany table, creating a slow, rhythmic beat that was designed to sound like a countdown. He looked directly at me, his eyes narrowing into cold, predatory slits. He asked me if I honestly believed I had just delivered a fatal blow. He asked if I had watched too many cheap television crime dramas and confused them with actual reality. He slowly pushed his chair back and stood up, buttoning his immaculate suit jacket with complete arrogant calm. He began to pace slowly around the edge of the massive table, closing the physical distance between us. "Let me educate you on a fundamental concept of New York state law. Chloe," he began, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "It is a very simple legal precedent known as the fruit of the poisonous tree. I highly doubt they teach constitutional law in whatever basic accounting classes you took, but in my world it is the absolute gold standard of defense." Richard stopped pacing and leaned his weight against the heavy wooden chair right next to me. He gestured casually toward the empty space where the documents had been before he threw them away. He explained that in the eyes of the law, the origin of the evidence is just as important as the evidence itself. He stated that I was not a federal agent. I did not possess a law enforcement badge. I did not walk into Julian office with a legally binding subpoena signed by a state judge. He smiled a terrifying shark-like grin. He told me that I was just a disgruntled, soon-to-be ex-wife who admitted in front of witnesses to executing a highly illegal, unauthorized cyber intrusion into a private corporate server. Because the method I used to obtain those digital files was a felony, every single piece of data I downloaded was legally classified as poisoned fruit. He practically spat the words at me, his voice rising in volume and intensity. He declared that those financial ledgers were entirely inadmissible in any civil divorce proceeding. He promised me that if I ever tried to present those documents to a family court judge, they would not just throw the evidence out. They would throw me directly into a holding cell. He said the court would view my actions as a malicious act of corporate sabotage designed purely to manipulate a financial settlement. I stood perfectly still, letting his aggressive tirade wash over me. I could see Julian out of the corner of my eye. The color was rapidly returning to his face. The absolute sheer terror that had paralyzed him just moments ago was evaporating, replaced by a renewed, sickening wave of arrogant confidence. Julian realized that his expensive attack dog was doing exactly what he paid him to do. He realized that the law could be twisted and weaponized to protect his crimes. Richard crossed his arms over his chest, completely shifting his tactical approach from defensive to aggressively offensive. He told me that the situation had just changed drastically. He stated that he was no longer just going to file a simple data theft charge against me. He announced that he was officially preparing a massive civil lawsuit for extortion and criminal defamation. He laid out his fabricated narrative with terrifying legal precision. He said he was going to tell the district attorney that I fabricated a series of completely fake financial documents using my administrative knowledge of the company. He would claim that I walked into his law firm today and threatened to leak those fake documents to the public press unless Julian paid me millions of dollars in the divorce settlement. He called it textbook blackmail. He stepped so close to me I could smell the expensive strong cologne on his suit. He whispered that I had just handed him everything he needed to destroy my life permanently. He said a defamation and extortion lawsuit would instantly freeze whatever tiny assets I had left. He promised to drag the litigation out for years, burying me under a mountain of legal fees until I was forced to declare personal bankruptcy. He said by the time he was finished with me, I would not even be able to rent a cheap apartment in the city, let alone work in the financial sector. Lexi let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief from across the table. She leaned her head affectionately against Julian's shoulder, a smug little smile returning to her glossy lips. She whispered to Julian that I was completely crazy and that he needed to get building security to escort me out of the lobby immediately. Julian stood up taller, adjusting his custom silk tie. He looked at me with absolute sheer disgust. He told me I was completely pathetic. He said I always tried to play the hero, but I was always entirely out of my depth. He reminded me of his upcoming national television interview again, stating that while I was rotting in a federal holding cell for extortion, he would be shaking hands with high-ranking government officials and securing billion-dollar contracts. Richard Cross walked back to his side of the table and picked up the printed cashier check for $15,000. He held it up in the air, waving it slightly like a white flag of surrender. He told me the offer was officially off the table. He said I was going to walk out of his office with absolutely nothing. He demanded that I hand over the encrypted titanium flash drive immediately. He ordered me to surrender the stolen data, sign a full non-disclosure agreement admitting to my crimes, and beg Julian for a shred of mercy. He stated that if I handed over the drive, he might convince his client not to call the police, waiting downstairs in the plaza. He gave me exactly 10 seconds to comply. He started counting backward from 10, his voice echoing loudly in the tense, silent room. They had expertly built a flawless legal cage around me. They used intimidation, complex legal doctrines, and sheer arrogance to make me feel entirely isolated and powerless. Richard Cross genuinely believed he had mentally broken me. He believed his aggressive lecture on the fruit of the poisonous tree had completely neutralized my digital evidence. But Richard Cross was operating under a massive fundamental misunderstanding of the entire situation. He was treating this conflict as a simple, messy civil divorce dispute over personal money and assets. He assumed my ultimate goal was to submit those papers to a family court judge just to secure a better alimony check. I did not flinch. I did not reach into my pocket to hand him the encrypted flash drive. I simply looked at Richard Cross and allowed a slow, genuine smile to spread across my face. I remembered Marcus Sterling's exact words from the text message. I was not supposed to argue with them. I was supposed to let them think they had completely won. I was supposed to let them dig their own graves as deep as they possibly could before kicking dirt over them. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the absolute power of the secret weapon I was holding. I looked Julian directly in the eyes, piercing right through his arrogant facade. I told them both that they were absolutely right. I agreed with Richard that a civil family court judge would never look at my evidence. I told them I had absolutely no intention of using the financial ledgers in a simple civil divorce proceeding. Julian frowned, his triumphant smile faltering slightly. Richard stopped counting, his eyes narrowing in sudden, sharp suspicion. They did not understand why I was not breaking down in tears. They did not understand why I was eagerly agreeing with them. The atmosphere in the massive glass boardroom shifted instantly from aggressive domination to tense, dangerous uncertainty. They thought the game was completely over, but they had no idea I had just rewritten all the rules of engagement. The heavy tension in the room was suddenly shattered by a cheerful electronic chime. Lexi had completely lost interest in the complex legal maneuvering. She pulled a sparkling pink smartphone from her designer handbag and held it up high above her head, angling the camera to capture her best lighting. She tapped the screen and instantly went live on her social media account, completely ignoring the severe corporate atmosphere of the boardroom. "Hey, everyone," she cooed, her voice sickly sweet and entirely oblivious to the gravity of the situation. "I'm just sitting here in the most boring legal meeting ever, waiting for my amazing boyfriend to finally take out the trash." She giggled loudly, tilting the camera to flash her expensive diamond tennis bracelet. She then flipped the camera lens to point directly at me. "Say hello to the bitter old auntie ex-wife, guys. She is currently begging for pennies while we are getting ready to officially move into our brand new $8 million penthouse tonight. Do not worry, I will do a massive room tour for you all the second we get the keys." Julian let out a low chuckle, clearly amused by her absolute lack of professionalism. Richard Cross rubbed his temples in mild annoyance but did not stop her. They allowed her to humiliate me on a public live stream because they genuinely believed I was utterly defeated and powerless to stop them. But as Lexi waved her diamond-covered wrist at the camera, my own cell phone began to vibrate violently inside my jacket pocket. It was not a single notification. It was a continuous, frantic pulse. I kept my face completely emotionless as I slowly slid my hand into my pocket and pulled my phone out just far enough to glance at the locked screen. I had spent the early hours of the morning coding a highly specialized tracking script, tying it directly to the digital signatures of Julian offshore cryptocurrency wallets. The script was designed to alert me the exact second any new transaction was initiated on the blockchain. The screen of my phone was completely flooded with bright red text alerts. My breath caught in my throat. I looked across the massive mahogany table. Julian was leaning back in his leather chair, offering a smug, confident smile for Lexi camera, but his left hand was hidden completely beneath the table. He was manipulating a secondary encrypted mobile device. He was not just sitting here enjoying my humiliation. He was using this exact mediation meeting as a physical alibi. While Richard Cross was busy distracting me with theatrical threats of extortion lawsuits, Julian was actively executing a massive digital liquidation. He was flushing the remaining millions of dollars in stolen data profits entirely out of the American banking system. I watched the alert numbers rapidly scrolling across my small screen. He was dumping the illicit funds into a complex automated tumbling protocol designed to scramble the digital fingerprints across thousands of anonymous international servers. Once that money fully processed and hit the final decentralized accounts in the Cayman Islands, it would be completely untouchable. Not even the federal government would be able to freeze it or recover the stolen capital. The timeline had just violently accelerated. I had assumed we had the rest of the afternoon to spring the trap with Marcus Sterling at the courthouse. But Julian was moving the money right now in real time. The digital progress bar on my tracking script showed the massive transfer was already 40% complete. I had less than 5 minutes before the entire fortune completely vanished into the dark web, leaving Julian fully funded and entirely immune to financial ruin. Lexi was still babbling endlessly to her live viewers, describing the custom Italian marble she planned to install in the penthouse kitchen. Richard was busy gathering his fabricated legal documents, preparing to officially throw me out of the building. They were completely blind to the invisible digital war happening right beneath their noses. The time for waiting and playing their twisted legal games was officially over. If I let Julian finish that transfer, he would have enough liquid, untraceable cash to hire an army of defense attorneys and flee the country the second the federal indictment dropped. I needed to shatter his concentration immediately. I needed to force him to take his hand off that hidden device before the digital transfer hit 100%. The countdown was ticking rapidly in my head, and I knew exactly what I had to do to tear his attention away from that screen. I stared directly into the lens of Lexi's glowing smartphone camera, ensuring thousands of her live viewers were watching my every single move. Then I shifted my gaze straight to Julian. I did not yell. I did not throw a tantrum. I simply smiled a cold, terrifying smile that made the blood completely drain from his face. My sudden sharp movement caused him to flinch, and I heard the distinct clatter of his hidden secondary phone dropping onto the floor beneath the mahogany table. His digital transfer was instantly interrupted. I stood up perfectly straight, smoothing the front of my charcoal gray suit. I looked down at the arrogant men sitting across from me and delivered my final words with absolute piercing clarity. "I will see you in federal court tomorrow morning. You should definitely keep that $15,000 check, Julian. You are going to need every single penny of it to pay your bail." Before Richard Cross or Julian could utter a single word of protest, I turned around and walked right out of the massive double oak doors. The shocked silence in the boardroom behind me was absolutely deafening. I marched down the long frosted glass corridor, my heels clicking sharply against the polished black marble floors. As soon as I was safely out of their sight, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I dialed Maya's number, and she answered on the very first ring. "It is time," I told her, my voice steady and completely focused. "Lock her out." Maya let out a fierce, triumphant laugh on the other end of the line. She was sitting at her massive desk in her luxury real estate office, staring at a complex security grid. As a top-tier senior broker, Maya possessed absolute elite administrative privileges over the building management systems of the most exclusive high-rises in Manhattan. She typed rapidly on her keyboard, accessing the master mainframe for the exact building where Julian had purchased the $8 million penthouse. With 3 swift keystrokes, Maya completely wiped the digital access profile for the property. She permanently disabled the electronic keycards, deactivated the private elevator permissions, and revoked every single biometric entry code assigned to Lexi. The luxurious penthouse was instantly transformed into an impenetrable sealed vault. But Maya was not finished. She immediately picked up her office telephone and dialed the direct emergency line for the local police precinct. She used her most authoritative and deeply concerned professional voice. She informed the police dispatcher that a highly aggressive, unauthorized individual was actively attempting to break into a vacant multi-million-dollar property held by a private trust. She described Lexi perfectly and demanded immediate officer intervention. Lexi was going to leave that law firm and head straight to her dream home to film her glamorous room tour. Instead, she was going to find herself completely locked out, throwing a massive tantrum in an upscale hallway right as the police arrived to arrest her for criminal trespassing. I stepped into the descending elevator and smiled as the silver doors finally closed. The first domino had officially fallen. The heavy oak doors of the district courthouse felt like the gates of a maximum security prison as I pushed them open the following morning. The courtroom was vast and intimidating, entirely paneled in dark mahogany wood with high vaulted ceilings that swallowed every sound. I walked down the center aisle, my footsteps echoing loudly against the polished marble floor. I was wearing the exact same charcoal gray power suit from yesterday, and my posture was perfectly straight, but the atmosphere in the room was undeniably hostile. I was completely alone, exactly as Marcus Sterling had instructed. But walking into that massive room without a lawyer felt like walking directly onto a battlefield without a shield. Julian and Richard Cross were already seated at the plaintiff table. They did not look like men who were facing a massive federal data theft scandal. They looked incredibly relaxed and entirely victorious. Julian was wearing another bespoke navy suit, resting his arm casually over the back of his heavy wooden chair. When he saw me walking alone toward the defendant table, a massive, smug grin spread across his face. He leaned over and whispered something to Richard, and both men let out a soft, arrogant chuckle. They genuinely believed they were about to witness my public execution. A loud, booming voice from the bailiff suddenly commanded everyone to rise. The heavy side door opened, and Judge Harrison walked into the courtroom. He was an older man with a stern, deeply wrinkled face and a dark black robe. But the exact moment he sat down at the elevated wooden bench, his entire stern demeanor completely vanished. He did not look at me. He looked directly past me, locking eyes with Richard Cross, and offered a wide, incredibly friendly smile. "Good morning, Richard," the judge said, his voice echoing loudly through the microphone on his desk. "I saw you out on the back nine at the country club last weekend. Your golf swing is looking significantly better these days." Richard stood up and buttoned his suit jacket, returning the warm, familiar smile with practiced ease. "Thank you, Your Honor," he replied smoothly. "I have been putting in a lot of practice lately. Hopefully we can get another round in this Sunday after we wrap up this unfortunate domestic matter." My stomach immediately sank, hitting the absolute floor. The entire legal system was supposed to be a blind, impartial scale of justice. But I was standing in a room where the referee was actively making weekend plans with the opposing team. Judge Harrison finally turned his attention toward me, and his friendly, warm smile completely evaporated. He looked at me over the rim of his reading glasses with a mixture of sheer annoyance and absolute boredom. He saw a woman standing completely alone without expensive legal representation, and he immediately categorized me as a pathetic waste of his valuable time. "Let us make this quick," the judge stated aggressively, shuffling a thick stack of legal papers on his desk. "I have reviewed the initial filings submitted by Mr. Cross this morning. This looks like a standard high-net-worth divorce complicated by some severe financial liabilities. What exactly is the holdup here, young lady?" Richard Cross remained standing, projecting the flawless image of a deeply concerned and reasonable professional. Your Honor, my client Julian has offered an incredibly generous settlement to his estranged wife, despite the fact that his health technology startup is currently drowning in a massive $5 million corporate debt. As the senior auditor and a managing officer of the company, she is legally responsible for exactly half of that massive financial burden. We offered her a clean break yesterday to spare her the bankruptcy proceedings, but she stubbornly refused. The judge frowned deeply, picking up his heavy pen. And why exactly did she refuse a clean exit from a failing company? This is where Richard completely twisted the knife, showing his absolute ruthlessness. Because, Your Honor, my client discovered yesterday that his wife has been executing illegal and unauthorized cyber intrusions into his private corporate network. She stole highly sensitive data and is now attempting to use fabricated financial documents to extort him for millions of dollars. I stepped forward, gripping the edge of the wooden table so hard my knuckles turned completely white. Your Honor, that is an absolute lie, I stated, my voice ringing clearly across the quiet courtroom. My husband is not bankrupt. He is actively hiding $8 million in stolen funds. I have a secure encrypted drive right here containing irrefutable proof of massive federal data trafficking and money laundering. I reached into my pocket to produce the silver titanium flash drive, but Judge Harrison slammed his heavy wooden gavel down so hard it sounded like a gunshot. Silence in my courtroom. The judge roared, his face turning completely red with sudden fury. I did not give you permission to speak, and I absolutely will not allow you to introduce stolen digital property into this civil proceeding. He pointed his heavy wooden gavel directly at my face, his voice dripping with pure judicial contempt. Mr. Cross already briefed my chambers on your little cyber espionage stunt yesterday afternoon. I am completely appalled by your behavior. Any data you illegally extracted from that corporate server is legally classified as fruit of the poisonous tree. It is entirely inadmissible in this court. I will not look at your drive. I will not review your fabricated ledgers. I am dismissing your so-called evidence in its absolute entirety. I stood completely frozen at the defense table. The judge had entirely neutralized my only weapon before I could even take it out of the box. He did not care about the actual truth. He only cared about protecting his golf partner, wealthy client. He was actively participating in the cover-up of a massive federal crime simply because Richard Cross was part of his exclusive boys' club. Julian slowly turned his head to look at me. The expression on his face was one of pure, unadulterated evil. He was looking at me as if I were a disgusting, pathetic insect, squirming helplessly on the bottom of his expensive leather shoe. He slowly and deliberately mouthed the words, "You lose perfectly," framing his arrogant, absolute victory. He had successfully manipulated the entire justice system to crush me. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses and looked back down at the final divorce decree Richard had provided. Since you have completely failed to present any admissible defense or retain proper legal counsel, the judge declared, his voice entirely devoid of any mercy, I am inclined to grant the plaintiff motion in full. I am officially ordering you to assume $2.5 million of the corporate debt. You will surrender all administrative access to the company immediately, and you will sign the non-disclosure agreement protecting Mr. Cross' client from your ongoing malicious defamation. The courtroom was suffocatingly quiet. The judge picked up his expensive black fountain pen and unscrewed the metal cap. He was about to sign his name on the bottom line. He was about to permanently shackle me to millions of dollars in fabricated debt and let Julian walk away with a massive illegal fortune to start his new life with his mistress. The gavel was about to fall and permanently destroy my entire future. The expensive black fountain pen hovered just a fraction of an inch above the crisp, white legal paper. Judge Harrison was smiling. A sick, terrible smile of absolute corrupt power. He was about to sign away my entire future. He was about to legally validate a massive federal crime simply to protect his weekend golf partner. I stood at the defendant table completely frozen. My lungs felt entirely empty. The air in the courtroom was incredibly heavy and suffocating. The massive mahogany walls seemed to be closing in on me, pressing down on my shoulders with the unbearable weight of a $5 million fabricated corporate debt. Julian was practically vibrating with joy next to his lawyer. He was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated venom. He wanted me to watch the exact moment my life was destroyed. He wanted to savor my complete humiliation. He wanted to watch me break down in tears and beg for mercy in front of the man he had bought and paid for. I closed my eyes for a brief second, Waiting for the sickening sound of the judge signing his name, I waited for the final strike of the heavy wooden gavel that would permanently seal my fate and send me into a lifetime of financial ruin. But the gavel never fell. Instead, a massive, deafening boom echoed through the massive chamber. The heavy, solid oak doors at the very back of the district courtroom were violently thrown open. The sound was so loud and so sudden that it sounded like a physical explosion. The heavy brass handles crashed violently against the mahogany-paneled walls, sending a shockwave through the dead silence of the room. Every single person in the courtroom froze. Judge Harrison stopped completely still, his hand hovering in midair, holding the pen. Richard Cross whipped his slicked-back head around so fast he nearly lost his balance. Julian let out a sharp gasp of surprise, his arrogant smile freezing awkwardly on his face. The armed bailiff standing near the door instinctively reached for his duty belt, but stopped dead in his tracks when he saw exactly who was stepping across the threshold. Standing in the center of the open doorway, perfectly framed by the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway, was Marcus Sterling. He did not look like an elderly man who had suffered a medical emergency on a transatlantic flight. He looked like an absolute unstoppable force of nature. He was wearing a meticulously tailored dark navy suit that radiated pure, unquestionable authority. In his right hand, he held a thick, heavy wooden cane topped with a solid, polished silver handle. His face was a mask of cold, lethal fury. His sharp, piercing eyes scanned the large room, absorbing the corruption in a single glance, and locked directly onto the judge sitting at the elevated bench. Marcus took his first step into the courtroom. He planted the silver-tipped cane firmly onto the polished marble floor. The sharp, heavy sound echoed violently across the high, vaulted ceilings of the room. It was not just a sound. It was a physical strike against the absolute corruption happening in this room. He took another slow, deliberate step. He did not rush. He did not speak a single word. He simply walked down the center aisle with the slow, measured pace of an apex predator circling its trapped prey. The rhythmic sound of the wooden cane hitting the stone floor completely took over the massive room. Every single strike felt like a ticking clock counting down to absolute destruction. The temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of defeat that had been crushing me moments ago completely evaporated, replaced by a sudden electric charge of pure justice. I watched the elevated wooden bench as the absolute reality of the situation finally hit Judge Harrison. The arrogant, dismissive attitude he had displayed just moments ago vanished completely. It was replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The color drained entirely from his wrinkled face, leaving him looking like a pale, sickly ghost. He recognized the man walking down the aisle. Every single judge in the entire state knew exactly who Marcus Sterling was. Marcus was not just a retired law professor. He was a former highly decorated federal judge. He was a man who had authored the exact same federal statutes this local judge was currently attempting to bypass. He was a legal titan with direct active connections to the highest levels of the Department of Justice in Washington. Judge Harrison began to physically tremble. The arrogant smirk melted off his face, leaving only the wide, panicked eyes of a man who realized his entire career was over. His fingers lost their grip completely. The expensive black fountain pen slipped from his trembling hand. It hit the wooden desk with a loud clatter and rolled slowly across the legal documents, leaving a dark, permanent trail of black ink across the signature line. The judge did not even attempt to catch it. He simply sat there entirely paralyzed, staring at Marcus. He knew his corrupt little arrangement with Richard Cross was completely exposed. He was looking at the man who would personally ensure he faced a federal judicial review board and massive criminal charges before the week was over. He was absolutely terrified. Down at the plaintiff table, the situation was even more pathetic. Richard Cross, the slick, ruthless corporate lawyer who had threatened to completely destroy my life and throw me in a federal penitentiary just 24 hours ago, was completely falling apart. He gripped the edge of the heavy mahogany table, trying to brace himself, but his hands were shaking so violently that the entire table seemed to vibrate. His perfectly slicked back hair suddenly looked ridiculous. His sharp, expensive suit could not hide the fact that his knees were physically giving out beneath him. Richard opened his mouth to speak, to object to the interruption, or to somehow defend his presence in the room, but absolutely no sound came out. He simply stuttered, taking a weak, unstable step backward. He knocked over his thick leather binder, sending a stack of fabricated legal documents spilling onto the floor. He did not even bend down to pick them up. He recognized the heavy wooden cane. He recognized the cold, ruthless gaze. Richard had built his entire career bullying weak opponents, manipulating evidence, and bribing local officials. He had absolutely no idea how to fight a man who actually wrote the constitutional laws he was breaking. He knew with absolute certainty that Marcus Sterling could have him disbarred, stripped of his legal license, and indicted for federal evidence tampering with a single phone call. The arrogant predator had instantly become terrified, helpless prey. But the most beautiful and incredibly satisfying reaction belonged entirely to my soon-to-be ex-husband. Julian was completely clueless. His massive inflated ego and his profound arrogance made him entirely blind to the reality of the situation. He did not know who Marcus Sterling was. He did not understand the complex hierarchy of the legal system. He only saw an elderly man with a cane interrupting his flawless multi-million-dollar victory. Julian looked at the terrified lawyer standing next to him. He looked up at the pale, trembling judge sitting at the bench. He could not comprehend why the two most powerful men he knew were suddenly acting as if a live explosive had just been rolled into the room. He could not understand why Richard was physically shaking and why the judge had dropped his pen. Julian threw his hands up in the air in an exaggerated gesture of sheer annoyance. He turned his head and glared at the old man walking down the aisle. He opened his mouth and let his massive ignorance completely ruin him. Julian demanded to know out loud who this crazy old man was and why he was interrupting his private court hearing. His voice echoed loudly in the silent room, dripping with his usual entitled disrespect. He aggressively pointed his finger at Marcus. He ordered the bailiff to remove the old man from the courtroom immediately so the judge could finish signing the corporate bankruptcy order. Julian loudly declared that he was a highly respected technology chief executive with an upcoming federal government contract, and he did not have time to sit around while some confused senior citizen wandered into the wrong room. I stood at the defendant table and felt a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I had never felt such a profound sense of absolute peace in my entire life. I looked at Julian and pitied his sheer blinding stupidity. He had just insulted a former federal judge in an open courtroom while actively sitting on $8 million in stolen cryptocurrency and a massive vault of stolen patient medical records. He had just demanded the forceful removal of the one man who had the absolute power to send him to a federal maximum security prison for the rest of his natural life. Marcus Sterling did not stop walking. He did not acknowledge Julian's pathetic, disrespectful outburst. He kept his eyes locked entirely on the terrified judge sitting at the bench. He reached the front of the room, crossing the small wooden gate that separated the gallery from the legal tables. He stopped directly next to me. He planted his heavy, silver-tipped cane onto the floor one final time. The loud strike echoed and then faded, leaving the courtroom completely engulfed in a heavy, suffocating silence. Marcus slowly turned his head to look at Richard Cross. The corporate lawyer actually flinched, stepping further away from the table and lowering his eyes to the floor. Then Marcus turned his gaze to Julian. The cold, penetrating stare was so powerful, it actually made Julian take a sudden nervous breath. The arrogant tech executive finally began to realize that he had made a catastrophic mistake, but it was already far too late to fix it. The trap was completely sprung, and the steel jaws were already closed. I stood tall right next to my brilliant ally. I did not need to say a single word. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my charcoal gray suit and pulled out the encrypted silver titanium flash drive. I placed it gently onto the wooden table right in front of Marcus. The digital bomb was officially armed. We were no longer fighting a messy, corrupt local divorce. We were executing a flawless federal takedown, and Julian was about to lose absolutely everything. The silence in the massive courtroom was so absolute you could hear the faint ticking of the wooden clock on the back wall. Marcus Sterling stood perfectly still, his hands resting casually on the polished silver handle of his heavy cane. He did not yell. He did not need to raise his voice to command the room. He spoke with the quiet, devastating authority of a man who held the full, terrifying power of the federal government directly in the palm of his hand. "I am Marcus Sterling," he announced, his deep voice echoing clearly across the mahogany paneling. "I am the head of the Anti-Corruption and Cybercrimes Task Force for the United States Department of Justice." The words hit the room like a physical shockwave, completely shattering the corrupt atmosphere. Judge Harrison did not just sit there. He practically scrambled to his feet in sheer panic. His heavy leather chair rolled backward and slammed loudly against the wooden wall behind the elevated bench. Sweat immediately began pouring down his pale, wrinkled forehead, soaking into the collar of his black judicial robe. He leaned over the heavy wooden desk, his hands trembling so violently that the papers scattered everywhere. "Mr. Sterling, the judge," stammered, his voice cracking loudly with pure, unfiltered terror. "I had absolutely no idea you were coming to my courtroom today, Mr. Sterling. If I had known, I would have made the proper arrangements for your arrival. We were simply reviewing some basic preliminary documents here, Mr. Sterling. Absolutely nothing has been finalized today, I assure you." The corrupt local judge was openly begging in his own courtroom. He was desperately trying to backtrack, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that his pen had literally been hovering over my final divorce decree just 60 seconds ago. He knew exactly who Marcus was. He knew Marcus had the absolute authority to have him dragged out of the courthouse in federal handcuffs and strip him of his judicial pension before the court even broke for lunch. Richard Cross looked like he was about to physically collapse. The slick corporate lawyer slowly raised both of his hands in the air, keeping them completely visible. It was a universal gesture of absolute, unconditional surrender. He backed away from the plaintiff table, taking 3 large steps to physically distance himself from his own client. Richard knew that associating with Julian for even 1 single second longer would drag him straight down into a massive federal indictment. "I formally withdraw as legal counsel for the plaintiff," Richard announced, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "I have absolutely no further involvement in this matter, Your Honor." He abandoned his client instantly, throwing Julian directly to the wolves just to save his own license. And then there was Julian. The arrogant tech executive was completely frozen in place. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but absolutely no sound came out. The blood rushed entirely out of his face, leaving him looking like a terrified little boy staring into the headlights of an oncoming train. He slowly looked up at the trembling judge and then turned to see his expensive lawyer actively cowering in the corner of the room. The devastating reality finally crushed Julian. The crazy old man he had just openly insulted, the man he had just arrogantly ordered the bailiff to throw out of the room, was the highest-ranking federal prosecutor in the entire Eastern Division. Julian realized with absolute horrifying clarity that he had not just poked a hornet nest, he had walked blindly into a massive federal trap carrying $8 million of stolen cryptocurrency and thousands of highly classified medical records. He realized that I had not been fighting a simple family court battle. I had been feeding him directly to the Department of Justice. His upcoming primetime national television interview, his multi-million-dollar government contracts, and his luxury penthouse were all completely gone. His entire life was officially over. Marcus turned his cold, piercing gaze back to the judge. He lifted his heavy cane and pointed the silver tip directly at the encrypted titanium flash drive resting quietly on my defense table. That digital drive contains irrefutable cryptographic proof of massive federal data trafficking, international money laundering, and severe corporate fraud. Marcus declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "I am officially taking federal jurisdiction over this entire case immediately." Julian's legs finally gave out. He collapsed heavily into his wooden chair, his arrogant empire completely reduced to ashes in a matter of seconds. He stared blankly at the marble floor, finally understanding that the quiet data auditor he thought he could easily destroy was the exact person who just signed his ticket to a federal penitentiary. Richard Cross was completely backed into a corner, but his massive ego forced him to make one final desperate attempt to save his reputation. He took a hesitant step forward, his hands still shaking violently. He addressed Marcus Sterling, trying to use his slick corporate lawyer voice, but it sounded completely hollow and weak. He argued that despite the sudden federal presence, the encrypted drive was still obtained without a legal search warrant. He loudly cited the Fourth Amendment and desperately clung to his argument that the Home Office was a private domestic residence. He insisted that any data taken from the server was legally protected by strict marital privacy laws and therefore entirely inadmissible even in a federal courtroom. Marcus Sterling did not even blink. He looked at Richard with absolute sheer pity. He leaned heavily on his polished silver cane and delivered a devastating legal strike that completely shattered the final remaining defense. Marcus stated that Richard was completely misinterpreting federal law. He cited a massive Supreme Court precedent regarding the use of private residential property in the active commission of severe financial felonies. Marcus explained in a booming authoritative voice that the absolute second Julian routed illicit cryptocurrency through the servers in his home office, he completely forfeited all legal expectations of personal privacy. The home office was no longer a private marital space. It was the active digital staging ground for a massive federal crime. Because the network was deliberately used to launder dirty money and commit international wire fraud, any evidence extracted from that network by a legal resident of the home was completely exempt from the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine. The evidence was entirely admissible and fully legal in every single court in the country. Richard Cross physically deflated. The final layer of his fabricated legal shield was completely gone. He realized there was absolutely no loophole, no obscure technicality, and no corrupt local judge that could save them now. He knew that if he continued to defend this case, he would be federally indicted for actively participating in a criminal conspiracy. He slowly packed his expensive leather briefcase, his hands trembling uncontrollably. Without saying another word to his client, Richard turned around and walked directly out of the heavy oak doors. He left Julian completely abandoned and utterly defenseless. I stepped forward, leaving the defense table behind. I walked directly to the center of the room, standing right next to Marcus. I looked at Julian, who was now sweating profusely and visibly hyperventilating in his chair. I did not raise my voice. I did not show anger. I spoke with the absolute cold precision of a senior auditor delivering a fatal corporate report. I explained to the terrified room exactly what Julian had done. I told them that this was never just about hiding marital assets or a simple greedy divorce dispute. I revealed the exact contents of the encrypted titanium drive. I explained that Julian had systematically stolen millions of private medical records from his own health technology company. He deliberately sold that highly classified patient data to shady overseas brokers and funneled the massive illegal profits through a complex web of anonymous cryptocurrency wallets. But I was not finished. I delivered the final crushing blow to his entire fabricated empire. I explained that Julian did not just keep the dirty money to buy his luxury penthouse and expensive watches. I detailed exactly how he actively embezzled those specific funds to create massive untraceable cash pools. He used those exact illicit cash pools to illegally bribe high-ranking government officials in order to secure his upcoming massive federal contract with the Department of Health. The courtroom fell completely silent. The sheer catastrophic scale of the corruption was absolutely breathtaking. I had just laid out a flawless, heavily documented roadmap of massive federal bribery, extortion, and data trafficking. Julian completely snapped. The flawless, polished facade of the brilliant, untouchable technology visionary shattered into a million tiny pieces. His massive, fragile ego simply could not process the reality that he had been entirely outsmarted and completely destroyed by the exact woman he had treated like absolute garbage for years. He jumped up from the plaintiff table, violently kicking his heavy wooden chair backward. It crashed loudly onto the polished marble floor, but he did not care. His face was bright crimson red and the veins in his neck were visibly bulging. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and began to scream at the top of his lungs, completely forgetting where he was and who was watching him. He screamed that I was nothing but a pathetic, boring accountant. He yelled that I had absolutely no vision and that I was completely jealous of his massive, untouchable success. He shouted that he built the entire technology company from the ground up and he had the absolute right to do whatever he wanted with the patient data because he owned everything. And then in a blind, uncontrollable rage, his massive arrogance made the ultimate fatal mistake. He screamed that I was entirely too late. He laughed a manic, desperate, echoing laugh and shouted that I could bring all the federal agents I wanted, but it would not make a single difference. He proudly and aggressively announced to the entire courtroom that the money was already gone. He screamed that he had successfully transferred all $8 million to completely untraceable secure accounts in the Cayman Islands during the mediation meeting just yesterday. He yelled that the federal government could never touch his money and that he was completely invincible. The loud echo of his screaming voice slowly faded into the high-vaulted ceiling of the massive courtroom. Julian stood there breathing heavily, his chest heaving with rage and adrenaline. Then he slowly looked around the quiet room. He saw the official court reporter rapidly typing every single word he had just shouted directly into the permanent federal record. He saw Judge Harrison staring at him with wide, horrified, completely panicked eyes. he saw Marcus Sterling offering a very cold, deeply satisfied smile. The horrible, devastating realization finally hit him like a physical blow to the chest. In his desperate, pathetic attempt to insult me and prove his absolute superiority, he had just stood in an open court of law on the official public record and loudly confessed to massive international money laundering, federal bribery, and wire fraud. I looked at Julian and smiled, my eyes completely devoid of any sympathy or mercy. I told him that he was absolutely right about one thing. He was the one who moved the illegal money. But I was the exact person who built the digital tracking script. The flawless legal cage was finally locked tight, and Julian had just willingly swallowed the key. Judge Harrison was completely trapped, and he knew it with absolute terrifying certainty. The corrupt local magistrate practically collapsed backward into his heavy leather chair, his face completely drained of all color. He realized instantly that the only possible way to avoid spending the remainder of his natural life in a federal prison cell alongside Julian was to cooperate fully and immediately with the Department of Justice. The judge reached out and grabbed his heavy wooden gavel, but his hands were shaking so violently that he could barely keep his grip on the smooth handle. He did not even bother to look at the massive stack of fabricated divorce documents that Richard Cross had confidently submitted just an hour ago. He aggressively pushed the entire stack off his elevated wooden desk, letting the thick white legal papers scatter wildly across the polished marble floor like completely worthless pieces of trash. In a frantic, trembling voice that echoed loudly across the silent courtroom, Judge Harrison officially declared the immediate freezing of every single bank account, corporate holding, offshore trust, and real estate asset tied to Julian's name. He ruled right then and there that due to the massive, undeniable financial fraud and the active criminal conspiracy, I was immediately awarded 100% of all legitimate marital assets. I was granted full, absolute, and uncontested control of the health technology company. Julian was completely stripped of his executive title, his corporate equity, and his freedom in a matter of a few devastating seconds. Before Judge Harrison could even finish reading his frantic ruling into the official record, the heavy oak doors at the very back of the courtroom swung open once again. This time it was not a single elderly man walking through them. 4 heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow across their broad chests marched rapidly down the center aisle. Marcus Sterling had made a single phone call hours ago, quietly orchestrating this exact, precise moment. The agents completely bypassed the wooden gallery gate and walked directly up to the plaintiff table. Julian did not attempt to run. He did not try to physically fight them or argue his innocence. His entire body simply went completely limp. The arrogant, untouchable technology genius who had mocked me just minutes earlier now looked like a pathetic, broken shell of a man. The lead federal agent grabbed Julian roughly by the shoulder of his expensive, custom-tailored suit and forced him to stand up on his feet. The agent loudly read Julian his rights, informing him of the massive federal charges of wire fraud, corporate espionage, and international money laundering. The cold, sharp, metallic sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed loudly through the silent mahogany room. It was the most beautiful, incredibly satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Julian lowered his head deeply, his perfectly styled dark hair falling messily over his pale, sweating face. He was slowly escorted out of the room, dragging his expensive leather shoes across the marble floor, completely destroyed and utterly humiliated in front of everyone. I turned and thanked Marcus Sterling for his brilliant guidance before walking out of the massive courtroom feeling completely weightless. The heavy, suffocating burden of fear and manipulation that I had carried for months was completely gone. But the final act of this pathetic tragedy was waiting for me right out in the grand marble hallway. Lexi was pacing frantically back and forth near the massive stone columns, looking like an absolute unhinged maniac. Her flawless designer makeup was completely ruined. Dark, heavy streaks of expensive black mascara were running down her cheeks, mixing with her panicked tears. Maya had successfully executed her part of the plan perfectly. The local police had forcibly removed Lexi from the luxury penthouse lobby earlier that morning, threatening her with criminal trespassing charges. Lexi had rushed straight to the federal courthouse looking for Julian to fix her completely ruined life and buy her way out of trouble. When she saw Julian being dragged out of the heavy courtroom doors by 4 armed federal agents, her eyes went wide with absolute sheer terror. She realized instantly that the multi-million-dollar dream life she had eagerly sold her soul for was completely dead. Lexi did not run to comfort him in his darkest moment. She did not scream her undying devotion to her wealthy, powerful boyfriend. Her pure, selfish survival instinct kicked in, completely overriding whatever fake love she had pretended to feel for him. She aggressively backed away from Julian as if he were carrying a deadly, highly contagious disease. She waved her hands in the air and screamed at the federal agents that she had absolutely nothing to do with him. She yelled loudly down the echoing corridor that she was just an innocent, naive victim and that Julian had lied to her about where all the money came from. She frantically reached behind her neck, her perfectly manicured fingers scratching at her own skin as she desperately unclasped the heavy diamond tennis necklace Julian had bought her with the stolen patient money. She threw the expensive, sparkling jewelry directly at my feet, treating it like a piece of burning, toxic coal. She screamed that she did not want his dirty, stolen money, and she turned around, running frantically down the long marble corridor, desperately trying to escape the massive sinking ship before it dragged her under. Maya stepped out from behind a large stone pillar, completely unbothered and absolutely radiant in her sharp crimson power suit. She had her smartphone raised high in the air, perfectly framing the entire pathetic scene. She was recording every single second of Lexi running away like a coward and Julian hanging his head in absolute public disgrace. Maya lowered her phone and offered me a slow, incredibly satisfied smile. She crossed her arms over her chest and casually kicked the discarded diamond necklace across the polished floor with the sharp tip of her expensive designer high heel. The arrogant, cruel people who had actively tried to bury me under a mountain of lies and corrupt legal threats were now entirely destroyed by their own toxic greed. I stood tall in the bright courthouse hallway, breathing in the cool, fresh air of absolute freedom. The war was officially over, and I had won absolutely everything. 6 months can change absolutely everything when you finally stop playing by the rules of a narcissist. The federal justice system moves incredibly fast when a former judge like Marcus Sterling is personally overseeing the prosecution. Julian did not get to charm his way out of a courtroom ever again. Without his stolen millions to hire a team of elite defense attorneys, he was completely defenseless against the Department of Justice. The federal judge officially sentenced him to 12 long years in a maximum security penitentiary. The arrogant, untouchable technology executive who once wore custom-tailored Italian suits and drank expensive champagne on private jets was now wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He spends his days scrubbing cafeteria floors for 40 cents an hour, completely forgotten by the powerful people he tried so desperately to impress. Lexi did not fare much better in the aftermath. When the federal agents froze all of Julian's assets, they also seized every single expensive gift he had ever bought her with the stolen patient funds. Her designer handbags, her heavy diamond jewelry, and her luxury sports cars were all immediately confiscated by the government. She was forced to file for personal bankruptcy just 2 months later. The glamorous social media influencer, who had proudly laughed at me on a public live stream, was now working exhausting double shifts as a waitress in a cheap diner. She spends her nights wiping down sticky tables and desperately trying to pay off her massive, crushing credit card debt. As for me, I did not just survive the storm. I completely took over the weather. Marcus Sterling recognized my absolute precision and my refusal to back down under immense psychological pressure. With his powerful personal recommendation, I did not just get a new job. I was officially named a senior partner at one of the most prestigious corporate risk auditing firms in Manhattan. I stood quietly in my massive new corner office, staring out through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. I looked down at the sprawling, bustling city of New York, spreading out endlessly beneath me. The city looked incredibly small from this high up. There were absolutely no tears of relief. There was no lingering sadness over a broken marriage or a toxic past. There was only the cold, absolute certainty of a woman who finally recognized her own immense, unstoppable power. I had walked straight into a fire that was deliberately designed to completely destroy me, and I had walked out owning the entire building. When a manipulator tries to back you into a dark corner and tells you that you are entirely powerless, they are doing it because they are absolutely terrified of what you might do if you actually realize your true strength. Never let anyone rewrite your reality. Never let a toxic person convince you that you have to surrender your dignity just to survive their games. If they try to build a cage around you, you take their raw materials and you build a throne. if you have ever had to fight back against a manipulator and completely rewrite the rules of their twisted game. I want to hear your story. Drop a comment below and let me know exactly how you took your power back.